forward. So let's kind of just refresh where we are. I think we're done. Yeah, we're not picking up the calculator anymore today. So that's good. So I just want to say a few more things, kind of wrap up chapter 14. And then we'll look at this homework assignment. Like I said, there's just a couple funny little things on the homework assignment. So we need to make sure we have a conversation about it so you guys can complete that. But before we do that, now that we've had a minute to breathe and eat, any questions that we have on the closing disclosure that we did before lunch? I like this one. It's kind of a good introduction showing how, again, we're going to go in order of the closing disclosure and fill in the closing disclosure as we go through the problem. That makes sure we have everything. We don't want to skip anything. And then just adding it up. Once you get everything filled in, just adding it up. So I think we can go ahead and agree. Knowing what's a debit to what party, what's a credit to each party, I think is the bigger challenge with these. So remember, you have that cheat sheet that I provided you guys. I think just spending time with the closing disclosure and seeing, the loan costs, everything with the loan is in page 1, government recording fees, prepaids. If nothing else, if we're just more familiar with what goes where, that can save you guys some precious test time next week. And, one thing we'll talk about, when y'all are done with the test, you're done. So you need to hang around. So the sooner you can get through the test and pass, you get it done. And remember, I'm around all week. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me. So the one we just did was the in-class, the section 4, the in-class CD example. At the bottom, after this page, you have the calculations worked out. So here's the loan costs. If you want to know, your prorations or whatever, here's your escrows, for example. So the calculations are included in that CD example. And then, of course, we've included a completed closing disclosure as well. So you can come back through, and we record it. So you can go back through your own pace, if you will. Also in the online learning system, there's CD1 with solutions, CD2 with solutions, 3 and 4, 5, extra CD1 through 4. So you guys got lots of practice in here. I might have mentioned, in case I didn't, there are a total of 6 math problems on your exam next Sunday. There's 40 questions total. You can miss 10 and still pass. So the math alone can't fail you. But if you're missing 6 math, you can't miss many more of the other stuff. So the 6 math that you're going to see, there are the 4 from the closing disclosure, 2 from the bottom of page 1, 2 from the bottom of page 2. And then you'll also have standalone, 2 standalone proration problems. So by you guys doing this practice, this closing disclosure, you'll prorate a few times and then give yourselves the ability to be able to get through that math. Use the math to your advantage. So our homework recommendation, you're welcome to do any and all of these. But the one I'm going to give for a homework recommendation is in the section 4 material. And it is closing disclosure CD with solution link number 4. CD number 4 with solution links. Everybody see that? Can I see head bobs or thumbs up acknowledgement that everybody sees that? Thank you. So again, I can't make it mandatory. So you don't have to do this. I can't make you do anything. But hear me. If you can do CD number 4 with solutions, if you can do this one, you will have done what you need to know for your test. There's a reason why I picked this one. So the best way to prepare you for exam is to do CD number 4. We will go through this one together next Sunday in class, but it's going to mean a lot more to you guys if you work through it on your own instead of watching me doing another one. So homework recommendation, CD number 4. We'll do this again next Sunday. That'll give us a good chance to review it and go through it and fine tune things to get you ready for that test. Questions or comments on this piece? Where it is, what we're doing. Section 4 material. Where is it? There it is. Section 4, CD4. There's a couple funny things in this one that I do want to talk about. It's really big. Better. So this is the closing disclosure, the one that we just did. I'm just using it, pulling it up as an example. You guys are going to do the same thing. Again, just read the problem, the information. But just a few kind of funny things I want to bring to your attention so you know how to do them for the homework. So you got the information, closings in May, earnest money, due diligence, there's your financing information. Funny thing number one that we need to talk about. Within the financing information, it says the seller has agreed to pay half of the loan discount point. So let's talk about that. Discount point is something that the lender charges the borrower. This is something that the lender may have, the borrower may have to pay as part of their lender fees. Anything is negotiable though, right? So the buyer's going to buy half a discount point, but the seller has agreed to pay that discount point. So what we need to talk about is how this is going to look on the closing disclosure. How does this shake out? And we're going to actually see this thing 3 times on the closing disclosure, and this is why. Please always remember, the relationship is with the lender and the borrower. The relationship is not with the lender and the seller. So the first entry on the closing disclosure that we have to show is the buyer paying the lender for the half a discount point. That's similar, exactly what we did on the first closing disclosure, right? The buyer paid the lender, debit the buyer for the discount point. So the discount point will go under A as in apple, A1, where it always goes. It's not that amount. Don't look at that amount. I'm not giving you the answer. But it is 0.5% of the loan amount. So you take the loan amount times 0.5%, and that amount will go under A1. Because that's the relationship. The lender can't collect from the seller because the lender doesn't have a relationship with the seller. So that piece is exactly the same. Do I have everybody so far? On a side negotiation, it is the buyer and the seller that came together and agreed for the seller to pay that half discount point. So on page 1, we have the buyer paying their lender. And now on page 2, we need to show the seller paying the buyer. So if we skip ahead, we have an entry on page 1. And then on page 2, I'm going to squash that up a little bit so we can see everything. On page 2, it's going to shake out as a credit to the buyer under L. As a matter of fact, we can put it under L5. And it's also going to be a debit to the seller under N. So N8, N as in Nancy. So A1, where we always put it, loan amount times 0.5%. A1, where we always put it. And then L5 and N8. This is why. This is what I'm doing. Let's get a visual of what we're doing here. Remember we said earlier, how do you cancel out a debit? You cancel out a debit with a credit. So on A1, we did a debit the buyer. On A1, debit the buyer. Then fast forward over on page 2, and on L, what is it? L, where'd it go? 5, we did credit the buyer. And on N8, we did debit the seller. So we debited the buyer in A, because that's the relationship. The buyer's got to pay their lender. And then on the L and N, we did a debit the buyer, credit the seller. What happens? How much is the buyer now paying in discount points? Didn't that cancel it out? When we credited the buyer, didn't it cancel out their debit? So now that we've canceled that out, who do we have paying the discount point? Who's the debit coming from? The seller. What makes this one funny is understanding that relationship is between the buyer and the lender. The lender can't collect money from the seller. So it was going to be a triple entry. Isn't that fun? A triple entry item. A, L, and N. Seller has agreed to pay half of the discount point. Questions? The other funny thing going on in this closing disclosure that we're going to look at next Sunday. We talked about this yesterday. If the listing firm is holding the earnest money, we had a couple different options about how we can get that money to settlement. And the second option that we talked about, the new way to do it, when you pick your check up from the attorney, the check is not going to be for the full amount of the commission. It's going to be the commission minus the earnest money deposit. So if the listing firm is holding the earnest money, they are going to accept that much less from the closing attorney. And again, how that shakes out on the settlement statement is a funny little thing that we need to talk about. So when we look at your commission, we're told it's 5.5% of the sales price. And then there's a note that says at closing, the listing firm will retain the earnest money as part of the brokerage fee. So let's talk about how that's going to look on our closing disclosure. The earnest money will always be accredited to the buyer, a credit to the buyer. So that piece isn't going to change. They paid that money to the escrow agent when we went under contract. Now that we're closing, we're going to credit that to the buyer. So the earnest money amount will go under L as in Larry 1, credit to the buyer. Nothing new. What is new is how we need to show the firm only collecting that much less commission, the commission minus the earnest money deposit. Because the seller is contractually obligated. They have a listing agreement to pay us 5.5%. So we're going to collect everything from the seller. It's just how it shakes out on the closing disclosure. So the first thing we're going to do is up here under H1, Heather 1, for our commission. And the amount of commission that you're going to put is the total commission, TOTAL, minus the earnest money deposit. And that's the amount that goes in H1. The total commission, whatever the total commission is, minus the earnest money deposit. The reason being, remember, everything on page 1 is a debit to the third party. And in this case, the firm is only going to pick up a check for the amount of the commission minus the earnest money deposit. So the amount on the check needs to reflect the amount from the settlement statement, the closing disclosure. So H1, you have the total commission minus the earnest money deposit. That's the amount of the check that the firm's going to collect. And that's what goes on H1. Didn't I just say the seller was contractually obligated to pay a total commission of 5.5%? So because they are still obligated to pay that, we need to do another debit from the seller. So we're going to see a debit from the seller paid at closing under H1. And then if we go to page 2, the amount of the earnest money deposit is going to go under N1, N as in Nancy, under excess deposit. So now what we're saying is that H1 plus the amount that we put in N1 is going to equal the total commission that the seller agreed to pay in our exclusive right to sell listing agreement. I still have the seller paying the full amount, right? It's just how it needs to shake out on the closing disclosure. N, yep, N is in Nancy. So the excess deposit, we're going to debit the seller. So we're charging the seller on H1, we're charging the seller on N1. And remember, we're still crediting it back to the buyer on L1. That's not changed. So you as the agent, you pick your check up, your check is not the full amount of commission. It's the commission minus the earnest money deposit. You take that check back to your firm deposits it in their account, and then your firm will transfer the earnest money deposit from their trust account to their operating account. Doing it this way, instead of letting the firm write a check, the agent pick the check up, the agent take it to the attorney's office, the attorney have to cash it, There's a lot of hands that just touched it, right? And I think one thing that we can agree when it comes to money, the fewer hands that touch it, the safest it is. So this way, we're not running checks back and forth. We're not touching it. We're just collecting less from closing and then transferring the difference to your firm when they get back. Again, this only applies if your firm is holding the earnest money. So credit the buyer in L. Part of the commissions in H1. The rest of it, which will equal the amount of the earnest money deposit, is in N1. Questions?
I'm sorry, but can you do like a quick brief review for the H1 plus N1? And my H1 is what my earnest money would have been? No.
Yes, no, the H1 is what you're going to collect from settlement because you're the third party. I think this is where it gets funny, right? The party is the transaction of the buyer and the seller. So you and I are a third party, which means we're going to get paid on page 1. So the amount of the check that we get is the total commission minus that earnest money deposit. That's the amount that we put on H1 because that's the amount that we're going to collect. The seller is contractually obligated to pay. What was it, 5.5%? I think that's what, 5.5%, that total of the purchase price. So that's why we have to do this other entry, which is going to be the amount of the earnest money deposit because that's our difference. So what we have here, we're going to have here. So now we have the seller paying commission under H1 and N1. So they are paying that total commission.
I think that last part just summed it up. Thank you.
Good, of course. Of course. What else can we sum up or clarify? Okay. Can I erase the pink? Have your notes. And again, you guys, I am around all week. All you got to do is reach out. I may not get back to you immediately, but I will get back to you. CD4, I'm on the section 4 of the online learning system. CD4, you just click on this link with the problem. Yeah, I give you the solutions, but how's that going to prepare you for your test? So I would use the solutions as a reference, something to grade yourself, something to guide yourself. And I'm here as well to help if you get stuck. If you do get stuck doing any of these closing disclosures, let me know which one you're working on. And as I've mentioned, pictures help me. So take a picture of your work, snap a screenshot, send me what you see, and I can help you get unstuck. But before y'all start the need to start banging your head on the desk, that's when you reach out to Julie. Let's not get to that point. Good? So 2 homework assignments this week. CD number 4 and sell a house. Good? Okay. I would love somebody to come back next Saturday and tell us you got somebody under contract so you can tell us all about it. Leaving the names and everything obviously out, but in general, that's what I like about Post. Kelly, do you have a question or are you good? All right, that gets us through chapter 14, which means we need to go back. We're spending most of the rest of our time in chapter 11. So my hard book people, we're going back to chapter 11, which starts on page 323. My digital people, you can find your chapter 11 section. And we are starting right at the beginning there, so you can follow along that way. As mentioned, the main attraction of chapter 11 is our standard offer to purchase and contract. So I got just a few things to say about that. And then we're going to start reviewing that offer to purchase and contract today, getting as far as we can. We'll finish that up on Saturday. And another big piece of this section is going through some of the commonly used addenda and amendments that go with the offer to purchase and contract. So next Saturday is going to be a really big forms day. We're not reading all the forms word for word, but we are going to have conversations about what they do and when you might want to use them. So that'll get us through. And then we'll talk about what Sunday's going to look like. So in this first section in chapter 11, we're going to discuss some sales contract preparations. We're going to do our detailed review, specifically of the offer to purchase and contract standard form 2T. We do have other offer to purchase and contracts available to us to use. So we are going to talk about what those are and when we would use them. But the main focus is going to be on 2T. And then we're going to mention our commonly used. NCAR is the North Carolina Association of Realtors. That's the state level of the National Association of Realtors. And NCAR is who provides us with the forms that we're allowed to use, the most commonly used forms that we use from NCAR. So when it comes to this section and us preparing the contract on behalf of our buyer or seller, I think it's good to start with what are our expectations, what's expected of us. We've talked about, or you talked about, we mentioned it, old car. Does anybody remember what the R in old car is? See mouths moving. That R in old car is reasonable skill, care, and diligence. Does reasonable skill, care, and diligence say that we have an obligation, we have a duty to properly complete these pre-printed forms on behalf of our buyers and sellers? This is a huge part of our responsibility. It's of my opinion, you may disagree with me, of course, but it's of my opinion of all of the forms that we use, I think the offer to purchase and contract is the most important, because that's the one that legally binds the buyer and the seller. That's the one that contractually puts them under obligation or under contract with each other. So it's important, part of the reasonable skill, care, and diligence is that we're familiar with the pre-printed forms that we're using, specifically the offer to purchase and contract, and any applicable amendment and addenda. As we've been saying, every transaction is different. So this transaction may require this set of addenda. Another transaction may require different things, so on. And so you may have one that you don't have any. They're all different. And that's where we need to have this knowledge and competence and experience to be able to know what is it that I need to add to my offer to purchase, and upon acceptance becomes a contract. Will you guys promise me something? Pinky swear me something, if we could, right? I want you guys to promise me that you will never, ever send a form to a buyer or seller to sign that you haven't read first. How are you sending it to them to sign if you have no idea what's in it? If you don't understand it, if you don't know what it means, I need you to find out what it means before you send it to them to sign. Because if you don't understand something, is there a really good chance that they might as well? So this is the expectations. We know what we're sending. Everybody pinky swear me? Julie, I promise I will read it before I send it. You may see a brand new form. Don't just send it on. So here you go, sign it. I don't know what this is really saying. Read it. I've mentioned some of my super simple philosophies. Another super simple philosophy I live by: when in doubt, find out. We have the resources. We have the opportunities there to help us understand what it is that we're filling in. One thing we'll learn, our offer to purchase and contracts from NCAR, there comes a guidelines to complete. So you have a step-by-step set of instructions on how to fill in the offer to purchase and contract. You have your broker in charge. You have peers in your office. You all that are affiliated with your firms, you're probably joined the local board of realtors. That got you in the North Carolina Association of Realtors and the National Association of Realtors. There are tools and benefits in both NCAR and NAR. So if you're paying those annual dues for your realtor benefits, your local board of realtor, state and national, take advantage of what you're paying for. Check those sites out and check out some upcoming trainings, different opportunities they have to help educate you in the forms. Another thing with our member benefits, for those of you that are affiliated and you are a member of the North Carolina Association of Realtors, did you know NCAR has a legal hotline? They have an attorney down there that we can email, we can text, we can call. So if you're really stuck and your BIC's not around, we got access to an attorney that we can reach out to down at NCAR. Again, just another one of those things that are member benefits that we're paying for those member benefits. So don't ever feel like you're stuck where nobody's there to help. We just need to get you knowing where to look and knowing where to find that help when you need it. Guys, I'm not kidding. I've been in the industry for 22 years, and I have never known a situation where a new agent doesn't walk out in a room and say, I need help, and agents come a-flocking. All you have to do is ask, and agents in your office will help. And one day you guys will be that seasoned agent. Maybe you can take a PB under your wing and help them out, make them do your open houses and copies and all that good stuff that you don't want to do. So there's your goal, right? Get you a PB that you can boss around. I mean, help get started into the industry. As you can imagine, the Real Estate Commission expects us to possess the competency necessary to prepare these forms, particularly the sales contract, as this discussion's about. There's a lot of form. I mean, real estate is known as the industry of paperwork, and that we don't get that reputation from nowhere. So just knowing what forms to prepare and how to properly prepare those. Understanding all the provisions of the form, of the contract, any addenda or an amendment. And then making sure everybody signs it, making sure that that final written word, all the points of the agreement are in the final written word. That's that parole evidence rule we talked about yesterday. Just making sure everybody signs it and dates it, that it's complete and everything is in there that needs to be. Listing agents, I think is particularly important when the contract comes in. If your seller is going to take any fixtures, listing agents, you need to make sure they're there. Buyer's agents, if your buyer wants any personal property, we need to make sure that it's there. So we need to pay attention to those various things. I think we're all good on this. We kind of drilled it into you in pre-licensing, and you've probably heard it a few times in post already. We cannot draft. Drafting legally binding documents are the job of the attorney, and we cannot draft. Guys, this is so important. We need to know the parameters of our job. Buyers and sellers do not know the parameters of our job. Buyers and sellers are going to ask you, can't you just put this in? Can't you just take that out? They think it's so easy for us to do. You will be asked. We need to be prepared how to respond. So can we just add? Can we just delete? Can we just cross out? Is it that easy? No, we need to make sure that we're referring them to an attorney, letting them know that I can't. They may be able to, but I can't. And knowing how to respond to those questions. I mean, let's face it, I'm a heck of a lot cheaper than an attorney, right? So they're going to probably come to me first to try to save money. And this is where we need to know how to respond. When it comes to the forms, the only thing we're allowed to do is fill in the blanks. Those blanks are there, the negotiated points of the contract, the things that the buyer and the seller has to agree with. We're not create legally binding documents. We're just finishing them. We're taking what was provided to us and filling in the blanks. NCAR provides the forms that we use the most often. Now, NCAR did join forces with the North Carolina Bar Association, and together they came up with our standard pre-printed forms. Our forms do not come from the Real Estate Commission. Our forms come from NCAR. So again, knowing the sources and where to find these things. The only thing that the commission provides us is the working with real estate agent disclosure, the RPOs, and the MOG. Everything else comes from NCAR. If you're a member of NCAR, you can use forms that rock the capital R Realtor logo. If you're not a member of NCAR, you cannot use Realtor forms. If you're not a member of NCAR, I think NCAR has a few non-Realtor forms that you can use, but usually those firms that choose not to join NCAR have an attorney draft up pre-printed forms for them that they can use. So this leads me to a really good point. I think a common misconception of licensees is that we can only use NCAR forms. And that is, in fact, a misconception. The NCAR forms are just the most commonly used. The truth is, we can use any pre-printed form as long as it was drafted by an attorney. Anybody done new construction yet? Kelly, it's not uncommon for builders to have their own contract. You're not going to submit an offer using 2T for a builder. They come with their own contract. And the concern is, oh my gosh, that's not NCAR. Can we use it? As long as it was drafted by an attorney. A great question comes in. Why would a broker not want to be an NCAR member? I know, right? It's going to be up to your firm. Some firms require it, some firms don't. Why some firms may not want to join, may not want to be a part of it. I mean, it depends on if they see what's beneficial or not. And I think, honestly, it kind of varies from market to market. For example, I had an agent take pre-licensing a year or so ago, and she was already licensed in Virginia. And she didn't have to take pre-licensing, but she thought this was a good time for a good refresher and to make sure she had everything in North Carolina. She was a very active agent in Virginia too. And when we got to the discussion about the NCAR forms, she said in her market in Virginia, it's rare for a firm to be NAR. I guess they don't see the value and the benefits. So it could just be what's common practice in your area. I don't know many firms here in the Triad that are not, but that might be common practice in our market. But if your firm is a member of NAR, NCAR, all that, then they're probably going to make you join as well. So they take the guesswork out of it for you. They say, if you want to join our firm, you're going to pay those dues and become a member. Good question. Thank you. So as mentioned, we can use any pre-printed form. Like we said, it's got to be drafted by an attorney. And if we are having an attorney draft a contract, a sales contract, we do need to make sure that the attorney drafting is in compliance with Commission Rule A.0112. Now we'll look at that rule, probably not today, but we'll look at it next weekend. That'll give us a good opportunity to review this. And what we're going to see in Rule A.0112 are 19 separately named issues that if a real estate agent is using a pre-printed form, must be included. And when we look at this rule, we're going to note that those 19 separately named issues are in our pre-printed forms. They are in standard form 2T. And that's why NCAR joined forces with the North Carolina Bar Association. That's what this here is, North Carolina Bar Association. So the pre-printed forms that we use have been drafted by attorneys. Some prohibited provisions in the contract, things that are not allowed. Remember what we said, you guys. The offer to purchase and contract is between who? Who are the parties to the transaction? Buyer and seller. Did I just say agent, broker? Nah. So big picture, you and I do not belong in the offer to purchase and contract because that's a document between the buyer and the seller. Specifically, the Real Estate Commission says we can't have any mention of our commission, compensation, rebate, kickback, bonus, nothing. No mention of our money, absolutely not allowed in the offer to purchase and contract. We are going to hash out our commission in our agency agreements, both the listing agreement and the buyer's agency agreement. And remember, everything's got to be in writing before we present the offer. So by the time I'm ready to call you up and say, I'm delivering you an offer, commission, bonuses, all of that has already been decided in writing by both the firm and the buyer or seller. The other thing specifically prohibited is any liability disclaimer, protecting the broker's actions or inactions. So you can't, let's say, for example, your buyer waives the pest inspection. And you say, are you serious? It's only like $85 and it'll tell you if you got termites. No, I'm going to call Terminex after closing. I don't need a pest inspection. I want to say that much. All right, they're getting a VA loan. I can't make them, right? So what I can't do is slip something in the contract to try to protect myself. Buyer waived pest inspection. That's what we mean by any liability disclaimer. We do have another form. It's not on the forms list for this class, but I do like to try to slip it in as an added bonus because it's our form. It's the form we can use to protect ourselves. And that's the professional services disclosure and election. And that's the form that the buyer can waive the pest inspection. Again, as time allows, I'll try to slip that in so we can be protected. As mentioned, I tell you, this slide makes my eye twitch a little bit. Although we can't draft, alter, delete, amend, the parties to the contract can. They can draft their own. They could come to a legally binding agreement on a subway napkin, as long as all the legalities are there, the important points are there, purchase price, date, that kind of thing. So they don't have to use, the parties don't have to have an official contract. I have a saying, just because you can Doesn't always mean that you should. And this is where we need to make sure we're advising our buyers and sellers. If they think they're going to whip out their red pen and start marking this thing up, and this doesn't apply to this, and I'm going to add that, delete that, da 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 da. Stop and look them in the eye and say, I highly recommend you talk to an attorney before you start altering, amending, or deleting provisions, adding provisions. I tend to think of the domino effect when non-attorneys start messing with these pre-printed forms. Because your buyers and sellers don't know. If they cross out a provision on page 2, they don't know how that's going to affect the contract on page 7. They don't know how adding legalities, deleting legalities can affect other provisions of the contract. And that's what I mean by the domino effect. You and I cannot explain those legalities. I don't know what happens if you cross out 2. That's why we need to, what we can do, and the best thing we can do is encourage them to talk to an attorney. Yes, they're going to have to pay money, but at least they know that that legally binding commitment that they're making is legit. And in the long run, they're not hurting themselves. So again, if this conversation happens face to face, when you go home that evening, I want you to send your party an email saying, per our conversation, it's my suggestion, my recommendation that you talk to an attorney before you make these changes on the contract yourself. So you have that documentation that you gave that advice. So the pre-printed forms that we have that we're getting ready to look at, the reason NCAR and NCBA created these forms is to give the forms uniformity to the transaction. It keeps things rather simple. While nothing is normal, and each transaction is different, at least we know we're starting from the same basic place of the pre-printed form. The pre-printed forms also reduce our temptation to draft. If they give us the information, then we already have it there. Other states, and I can't tell you which states, but other states may not have pre-printed contracts. So what other states use is something called a letter of intent. Buyer and seller exchange a letter of intent, basically agree on the terms. And then once they have that letter of intent, they contact an attorney to draft the actual contract. North Carolina does not use a letter of intent. Instead, we're provided with pre-printed forms. So the offer to purchase in contract 2T is the most common for a residential resale transaction. This is the one that we're going to spend our time on, the one we're going to look at. We do have other offer to purchase in contracts, though. If you are helping buyers and sellers purchase vacant lot or land, we have 12T, which is our offer to purchase in contract, vacant lot and land. If you're helping buyers and sellers with new construction, we have 800T, offer to purchase and contract new construction. All 3 of these come with the guidelines to complete, and they're available from your forms library and whatever electronic program your firm uses. Is it dotloop, zip forms, DocuSign, SkySlope, whatever you guys use? The guidelines to complete are available to make sure you're properly completing. I asked this yesterday. I don't think I had anybody. Nobody's doing commercial, right? No, look at some of you. You're like, no, okay, it's cool. It's cool. So there is, if you do ever wake up one day and decide to go into commercial, there is a contract in the commercial world as well, agreement for purchase and sale of real property, 580T. By the way, our forms from NCAR are all numbered. We don't need to know the numbers. Sometimes knowing the numbers helps us find them, because there's like a cajillion forms that NCAR provides. Any form you get your hands on that's in the 500 series, those are commercial forms. So if you're not doing commercial, stay away from 500 series. 400 series is property management. So it can kind of help us direct us in the right, point us in the right direction. Also, the agreement for purchase and sale of real property, 580T, does not come with the guidelines for completing. It's been my experience over the years talking to commercial agents throughout the years that 580T is a very basic and a very generic form and doesn't apply to most commercial transactions anyway. So a lot of times in commercial sales transactions, attorneys are drafting the form for us anyway. But if you do have a simple commercial transaction, they do have some basic forms available. And then, not to overwhelm you, but just a list of some other commonly used addenda. Now, we're not going to look at all of these, but we are going to look at most of these, actually, have a conversation about them. Understand this list is not inclusive. This is not all that we have available, but these are the more commonly used ones. This same list should be in your book. Where are we? 326 or so. So yeah, you're looking at a similar list back there. Again, we're going to look at some of these next weekend, spend more time on others, making sure that we have an idea of what to use when. And our contract's very helpful as well. So we will see that in a second. So I've mentioned the guidelines for completing. And if we look at the guidelines for completing 2T, standard form 2T, one thing that the guidelines gives us are general instructions for completing the form. So they give us a place to start. First thing they say is type if possible, otherwise print legibly in ink. I think in today's day and age, most everything we're doing is electronically. But if you ever find yourself in a situation where you have to take your pen and fill in standard form 2T, do so legibly and do it with a pen. Don't use a pencil or an orange crayon. Do it with a pen. Again, this was a bigger deal back in the day before electronic transactions. But what if you need to write an offer up today and your internet goes out, right? And Spectrum says they're not going to have you back on until tomorrow. Right? So there may be a situation where you need to handwrite it. When we are completing these pre-printed forms, we need to make sure that we're filling in all the blank spaces. Never leave a blank blank. We always need to acknowledge that blank space. This is for two reasons. The first reason, I don't want the other side to think that I forgot to put something in there. Did she mean to put something in there? Did she mean to leave it blank? The other reason, I don't want to leave it for the other side to slip something in to try to get away from us. So if you have a blank that's not applicable, put N/A. That one acknowledges that you acknowledge that blank, you acknowledge that it's not applicable for this transaction. And two, it doesn't let the other side be shady. If it's a $, we're not exchanging any money, I'll put a 0 in there. The point here is that we acknowledge all the blanks. General instructions remind us to be precise. Speaking broker is a whole new language. Buyers and sellers don't speak broker. So when we're filling out the legally binding form on their behalf, we need to use non-broker jargon. This is not the place for all of our acronyms, our abbreviations, broker speak. We need to fill them in for any member of the general public to understand. Any changes, additions, deletions got to be initial, dated, acknowledged by all parties. If you're doing it on the form yourself, we also have an amendment form that we can use to change a contract, one form that we'll look at. If we are making changes on the contract, on the paper, and we've initialed and dated by all parties so many times, eventually that might get difficult to read. If it gets difficult to read, prepare a novation, do a novation, a new contract that substitutes the one that you can't read. Keep the one you can't read, never throw anything away, but prepare a revised form that everybody can see. I don't think this is as big today as what it was pre-electronic transactions. Anybody ever pre-real estate get to have a fax machine? How many trips back and forth did paper make over the fax machine where it gets blurry and smudgy? And I think it gets smaller every time you send it. So now you have page 1 of offer to purchase and contracts like this big. Can you read it? Not easily. We're not dealing with that anymore. I'm telling you guys though, be prepared. The fax might come back. The fax is coming back to the medical profession. The fax might come back to real estate. It's a lot more secure than my Gmail email. So hang on, we might go back in time a little bit, but the fax may make a comeback. The last thing from general instructions we have is to review the contract provisions with the parties. Guys, I'm going to tell you something right now. Your buyers and sellers are not reading that offer to purchase and contract before they sign it. They're not. They're relying on you. This is why they have us. So you send it to them. Remember, you're reading it. You all just pinky swore me. You guys are reading it. You send it to them for signatures. And a minute and a half later, that thing is back in your box and signed. Did they read it? No, I'm telling you, every once in a while you get a reader. When you get a reader, be prepared for questions. But for the most part, they're relying on you. So if we know they're not reading it, we still need to make sure that we're reviewing these provisions. Things have been happening very fast. They've been moving very fast the last 2 years. I mean, homes are going under contract within hours. Now that market's slowing down. We're seeing now that we have a couple days at least, we're seeing changes. But even with that fast-paced market, that doesn't negate the agent's duty of explaining the process, the contract, the various provisions, etc. So depending on the market, how fast it's moving, how fast your buyer or seller ready to go, we need to make the time to explain these things to them. This is our duty and responsibility. Any questions about our general instructions? Again, from the guidelines. The other thing we have in regards to our sales contract specifically, we get a list of persistent problems from the commission. These are complaints that they've seen down over and over and over again regarding the contract that they're tired of seeing. So they introduce it to you guys so you don't form bad habits. They're telling seasoned agents to stop it. They're telling you guys don't start it. So one persistent problem that the commission is seeing, instead of filling in the name of the seller on the contract, agents are just putting owner of record. When we are completing a sales contract on behalf of our buyer or sellers, we need their full legal names. Putting owner of record, the commission says, is lazy. It could leave room for misinterpretation. Put their name in. We got to look at that deed anyway. Put their name in. Do not put owner of record. Another persistent problem they're seeing, a fixture is meant to stay, personal property is meant to go. Everybody with me? A fixture is going to stay, it's going to convey, personal property is going to go. It's not going to convey. The problem is listing. A fixture already conveys, personal property already goes. The only time we need to put them in the contract is when they're going to do the opposite of their intent. If a fixture is going to go, that's when we list it. If personal property is going to stay, that's when we list it. So make sure we're properly identifying, knowing what goes and what stays. There's a problem with defining critical dates. As we're going to see, for the most part, we're going to put a specific date in. We're going to say due diligence is through June 30th. We're not going to say due diligence is 15 days after the effective date. That gives people too many opportunities to count different. How do you come up with those 13 days? Blah. So we're just going to be specific and we're going to put the actual date in Due diligence, settlement, those dates, we're going to define those. This one blows my mind that this is a problem. Are y'all ready? A persistent problem down at the commission. Evidently, we're not timely presenting offers. I don't understand this one. I'm open for somebody to explain this to me. Why are we sitting on our offers? Why, when we get an offer in our hand, we're not calling the seller or the buyer right away and getting this transaction under contract? We can't get paid if it doesn't close. It's not going to close if we don't get it under contract. So why are we not timely presenting offers? Get them, present them to your buyers and sellers. And then the last persistent problem is our due diligence, repairs, and negotiations. We talked about that this morning. The repairs, any agreed upon repairs, have to be in writing and signed while we are still in due diligence. The repairs themselves don't have to be complete until prior to settlement. So habits not to start. If you've already started any of these habits, stop it. That's why they're called persistent problems. So we're getting ready to take a break. Didn't go anywhere yet, but we're getting ready to take a break. When we come back, we're going to get into our line by line, in some cases, word by word review of the offer to purchase and contract. So specifically, we're going to review standard form 2T. I will show you where you could find those guidelines for completing. We have those available. If you're not affiliated with a firm, you may want to consider grabbing those guidelines while you still have access to our online learning system. If you are affiliated with a firm, like we said, they have that as well. Also in your book, my hard book people, if you're in the purple book, starting on page 330 over to 355, these pages are explaining the provisions in the offer to purchase and contract. So back to our earlier conversation about when in doubt, find out, and all those resources you have to make sure that you're properly completing the offer to purchase and contract. You also have another resource in your real estate manual. So if you're in the big blue book, you might be a page or two off from me. If you're in the purple book, it's 330. If you're in the digital book, there should be a own little section you can scroll down until you see that review of major provisions in standard form 2T. Questions? Comments? All right, let's take 10. I got 210, so let's come back at 220. We're going to jump in our offer to purchase and contract. Welcome back. So before we jump into 2T, let me just kind of share a couple resources. Again, for those of you affiliated, I'm gonna assume that your firm is with Dotloop, DocuSign, SkySlope, ZipForms. Those of you that are affiliated using some kind of electronic program, you have access to the forms there. If you're not affiliated and you want to grab anything we're talking about so you can have to review, when we look in the online learning system under the welcome section, there's a link to current forms. And when you click on that link to current forms, it takes you to just that. So I think they're all in here. Yeah, property management, commercial, I mean, everything's in here. So if you're not affiliated, you don't have these available, you can get these forms here just as a resource. My digital people, I think I told you guys this yesterday, but it's kind of cool. My digital people, manual people, they got all the forms in here for us as well. Everybody remember, July 1st, we're getting new forms, some updates. Exclusive right to sell listing agreement, buyer's agency agreement, offer to purchase and contract. I think the additional provisions addendum has taken a change. So just be on alert in the next few weeks or month or so from your firm. They very well may announce a training of the new forms. I recommend that you get in on that so they can spend time telling you about what changed. You'll probably also get an email or have it available to you that'll come from NCAR. When they update the forms, they also provide a lot of times a markup. So they'll take the old form and then they'll highlight what's changed. So what was deleted, what was added. So in other words, when they update the forms, we don't have to do a side-by-side comparison of the old and the new and find the change. They give us the form with the markups and the highlights so we can see, and usually a summary of those changes. So we can see those changes pretty easily. Don't worry about it till July 1st. The good news is we'll be through this class, so we get just to focus on these forms. We don't have to worry about the new forms yet, but just know that's coming. Next year, there'll be another, the year after that, the year after that. I'm not going to say they change every single year, but they don't miss many. So just constantly be prepared for form changes, rule changes, all that good stuff. So our focus and where we'll be probably the rest of the afternoon. Where'd it go? Okay. Our focus is going to be on standard form 2T. So I got this pulled up. Can everybody see it? Okay. Everybody good? So we're going to go through this. I'm not going to stand here and read the whole thing to you. I'm going to read a few things so we can see it. But we're going to go through and kind of dissect this, break it down. Just by show of hands, how many of you have sat down and read this thing already? Several of you? Good, good, good. So we'll get to do it again. So if this isn't your first time, I hope we pick something up, maybe to help you, maybe to help solidify it. If this is your first time, hang on. So the offer to purchase and contract. Let's understand first off, this form serves two purposes. It begins as an offer to purchase and upon acceptance becomes a legally binding contract. So thank you, Forms Committee, for providing us with this one document to present the offer and to put that offer under contract. The first provision of our offer to purchase and contract, we're going to spend the first 2.5 pages defining terms and definitions. There's various things that we have to define. So we're going to spend the first couple pages going through that. And the first thing we're going to define is who are the sellers and who are the buyers. When we are filling in the names of the buyers and sellers, I need full legal names of all the parties. All the sellers that have to sign that deed to convey it and their spouses. All buyers that are going to be on the deed that are going to purchase it. Don't lump married people together. They are two separate entities. My name is not Mrs. Ryan Campbell. If you were writing an offer for my husband and I, you would have Ryan L. Campbell and Julie A. Campbell. We are two separate people. You may want to identify the relationship of the party. You may want to say married or husband and wife. That could help the attorney know how to make the deed, how we're going to take ownership. If they're not married, we want to make sure we get with the attorney so they can explain Tennessee in common or joint Tennessee, see how they want to take title. Again, if you want to identify that relationship, you're welcome to. I had a buyer once, and her mom was helping her get the loan. So mom co-signed the loan. And because mom's name was on the loan, mom wanted to be on the deed. Mom wanted to have that right. So when I wrote it up, I wrote both of their names, and then I identified their relationship as mother-daughter. So the attorney knew they were either going to take it as joint Tennessee or Tennessee in common. Full legal names, that's right. John Doe, yeah. As long as you have those full legal names. Yep. What's the best way to get their full legal name?
Get a copy of their license.
Has to see their driver's license. I think we talked, yes, exactly right. The attorney for the buyers is going to want to see the driver's license, so they can prevent that forgery. So they know that the buyer's buying or in fact the buyer's buying. So we want all names to be similar so everybody can look at these related transaction documents and know this is who we're talking about. It amazes me how many people don't know their full legal name. Blows my mind. So ask to see that driver's license. And I think, like we said yesterday, don't assume that your buyers are walking around with their driver's license. Tell them to bring their license with them to closing. Some of them are going to look at you like you're crazy, like, why wouldn't I have my driver's license on me? Other ones are going to go, oh man, thanks for telling me that. I'll make sure I grab it. So for the ones that say, oh man, thanks for telling me that, that's why we do it. Make sure that we're not delaying closing. As we go through this form, we're going to notice, like, for example, you guys see up here, it talks about the buyer and it talks about the seller. You notice how that B and that S are capitalized? You know, only proper nouns are capitalized, right? So in normal speak, buyer and seller are not going to be capitalized. However, in the form, when we see something like that, the reason it's capitalized, it's letting us know that it's defined somewhere in the form. So by capitalizing the B, by capitalizing the S, we're not just referring to any old buyer or seller. We're referring specifically to this buyer and this seller. So if you see that and your little grammar Nazi self goes off and you wonder what's up, that's why we're capitalizing that B and that S, because we've identified the proper noun elsewhere. The next thing we're going to define is the property. The property shall include all that real estate described below, together with all appurtenances thereto, including the improvements located, the fixtures, personal property described below. There's a big fancy word from pre-licensing. Who remembers what an appurtenance is? What does that do?
Attaches to the property.
It attaches to the property, Ashley, absolutely. It runs with the land. So something that's an appurtenant, it's going to convey from one owner to the next, to the next, to the next. It's appurtenant. It runs with the land. This property will or will not, one or the other, include a manufactured mobile home. If there is one included, buyer and seller, it's suggested that they complete the manufactured mobile home provision in the additional provisions addendum with this offer. One thing I like about our offer to purchase and contract a whole lot, when there's a need for us to use an addendum, it tells us. We don't have to look at that and wonder, oh, what do I do? What do I do? If there's a need to use an addendum or an amendment, it'll let us know. So if we do have a manufactured mobile home, Additional provisions addendum is one that we will look at next week. Next weekend when we look at our additional forms. Did you get froze up there, Sharon? I wonder if I can, I don't want to log you out. You're here now though on your other? Good. I see you move.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Technology is great when it works, right? So we have the property, whether or not there's a mobile home. Then we're going to fill in the street address, city, state, county. This is a North Carolina form from the North Carolina Association of Realtors for a property located in the state of North Carolina. So they did that for us. We don't have to put the state in. You're licensed in another state. You're helping your buyers buy or sell in Texas, for example. You're going to want to use Texas forms, Virginia, South Carolina. It's all about where the property is located. That's how you know how to proceed. 8 years ago, 10 years ago, I don't know, time gets away from me. They added to a lot of our forms these blue notes, and in a minute, we're going to see some red warnings. Blue notes and red warnings are designed to draw our attention to it. They're not meant for us to overlook it and ignore it. So the first blue note we see has government authority over taxes, zoning, school district, utilities, and mail delivery may differ from the address shown. Understand the street address and the mailing address may not be the same. You may have a street address of something Main Street or whatever. You may have a mailing address of like Route 8, you know? So if you get out in some rural areas, they may not be the same. Our contract is asking specifically for the street address. When we're conveying property, the documents that we use to convey property, the street address alone is not sufficient. We need more than the street address. The offer to purchase and contract is a document conveying property. So in addition to the street address, we also need the legal description, and we're instructed to complete all applicable. So this is where we're going to our county's GIS system, pulling up the real property data, the tax bill, the deed, all that good information about the property that we can find. We're going to put in for our legal description. There's our plat reference, lot unit block selection. Is it a subdivision or condominium? What's your plat book, slide, and page? The PIN or PID is referring to your tax ID. Every county calls it something different. So which one you use may depend on the county you're in. But we're looking for the PIN number, any other legal description, and then the deed book and page. When it comes to completing this, your firm may have policies. You may find the deed book and page and the owner's names, example, that kind of thing, in MLS. Some firms may say, despite what MLS, we want you pulling the deed anyway. We want you finding this information. I think for the most part, we can rely on MLS, but just remember, it's a human that put it in. So it may not be a bad idea to verify that by pulling the deed. Again, get with your firm's policy on that. See what they recommend that you do. Any documents you pull to research the property, whether you're getting ready to list it or help your buyer write it up, keep that, because that shows you did the work. That shows you did the deed. So save it, print it, put it in your transaction file. The next thing we're going to define is our purchase price. And the purchase price is broken down in several different components, several different things. So the first thing we have, the first line here is a purchase price, whatever the buyer is willing to pay for the property and the seller accepts the sales price, paid in US dollars upon the following terms. The next line, the next space is for our due diligence fee, made payable and delivered to the seller by the effective date in the form of a cash, personal check, official bank check, wire transfer, electronic transfer, specify service. So we're not only going to put the amount of the due diligence fee, but we also have who it's made payable to when it's due, and in what form we're going to deliver it. I know some agents, some buyers and sellers are starting to handle this through like Cash App or Venmo. That's not a problem. That's electronic transfer that we're seeing here. I will say there was an article that came out from the commission a couple months ago. They discovered something that was happening was that agents were using their own personal Cash App. So they were saying, you send me a Cash App and then I'll write a check to the seller. For example, Mary Ellie's shaking her head, no, you don't like that, did you? And that's good. Here's the deal, you guys. I cannot hold money in my account on somebody else's behalf unless it's an escrow account. So I get it. The agents were trying to be helpful. Send me a Cash App and I'll get it to the seller. I get it. But if we're going to do an electronic transfer, it needs to go directly from the buyer to the seller, which means the seller would need to share their Cash App. If I were an agent on either side of that transaction, I would require a screenshot of when it was either sent or received, depending on who you're talking to. Again, get with your firm. I recommend going to your BIC because this is new. And remember what we said yesterday, technology moves faster than the law. So the laws, the real estate laws are starting to catch up with this. I have seen there's going to be some more verbiage. I don't remember if it's in the contract itself, but there is going to be some more verbiage coming out with these form changes that addresses that Cash App, Venmo, PayPal kind of transaction. We're going to see a little bit more on that. But usually what we're seeing is some kind of check, personal check, bank check, etc. So the due diligence fee, again, this says by the effective date. I've heard another very small change was going to make our lives a little bit easier. They're going to change that to on the effective date, because by the effective date implies we should have already received it, right? So on means the due diligence is due today. It's been my experience, as long as the agents are in communication about delivering that due diligence fee, then we can get it to you as soon as possible. I'm going to be really honest with you guys. If we're negotiating a deal and we go under contract at 10:30 tonight, you're not getting that due diligence check until tomorrow. That's just the way it is. I'm not leaving the house after 10:30. I'm just not going to do it. I'm at an age now, you know. So as long as the agents are in communication, you know, congratulations on the contract. I'm meeting my buyer first thing in the morning. I'll have it delivered to your office by noon tomorrow, right? As long as we're in communication and when that's going to happen, I think we're pretty understanding. Questions on the, by the way, we're going to define more about the due diligence in just a minute. But for right now, any questions about what we're putting in under the purchase price for our due diligence fee? Then we have some earnest monies to consider. There's initial earnest money and additional earnest money. So let me go through these. Let's explain this, and then we'll talk about when we may use initial versus and or additional. So initial earnest money deposit is made payable and delivered to the escrow agent that we're going to identify in paragraph 1F. The initial earnest money deposit is going to be cash, personal check, official bank check, wire transfer, electronic transfer within 5 days of the effective date. So initial earnest money is due to the escrow agent within 5 days. Then we also have something called additional earnest money, made payable and delivered to the agent no later than 5 p.m. And then we're going to put a date in here. Additional earnest money is a time being of the essence. Time being of the essence is a drop dead date and time, which means additional earnest money is due by 5 p.m. on this date. At 5:01, it's late, and it may give the seller an option to terminate. Drop dead day and time. Additional earnest money can be cash, official bank check, wire transfer, or electronic transfer. Here's the deal with initial versus additional. Understand, they're both earnest money. It's just how the parties agree that the buyer is going to deposit it with the escrow agent. Sometimes we can make agreements. Maybe I offer you initial earnest money and the seller says, no, I want more. And the buyer says, I'm okay with that, but I don't have it right now. I get paid in 2 weeks. So I'll give you X amount in initial. I'll give you what you want, the rest of it in additional. We can kind of work that negotiation that way to make the parties agree. Another thing I've seen is 0 initial and all the earnest money, the additional due by 5 p.m. generally on the due diligence date. So let's review real quick what happens to that earnest money. If we're still in due diligence and the buyer terminates in due diligence, who gets the earnest money? Still in due diligence.
Buyer.
The buyer will get that back, right? The buyer's only going to lose the earnest money if they terminate after due diligence. So technically, the buyer's not losing any money, earnest money, until after due diligence. So some agents will say, I'm not even going to have them put it in the escrow account, in the escrow agent, until we know we're going to get through due diligence. It's the matter of either putting it in and getting it back, or just not putting it in until it's due and the buyer's made the decision to go through after beyond due diligence. There's no right way to do this. It's all in whatever the parties can agree to. So you and I as agents may come up with some creative solutions to help the parties come to the agreement. And one thing we can kind of have a little bit of workability with is how this earnest money is going to be delivered to the escrow agent. Remember, all the earnest money is doing is showing the buyer or showing the seller the buyer's good faith. The seller wants to know that this is a serious buyer. At some point, doesn't the seller need to make arrangements to live somewhere else? They either got to buy a new house or sign a lease. And before they start making those commitments, they'll want to know that it's a serious buyer. Nothing talks louder than money. So if they're putting up an adequate amount of earnest money, the seller has those warm fuzzies about that buyer. The other thing you'll notice here with additional earnest money, I don't have an option for a personal check. Additional earnest money is going to be readily available funds. Usually if earnest money is due on the due diligence date and settlements a week later, we may not have time for that to clear the bank. So because with additional earnest money, a lot of times we're closer to closing, we certainly don't want to delay settlement by waiting on the additional earnest money to clear. So personal check is not an option with additional. Other terms we may run into. Here's our assumption. If the buyer's assuming the seller's loan, there may be a deposit. If that's happening, we're instructed to use the loan assumption addendum. We may be dealing with seller financing in which there's going to be a deposit. And seller financing, the seller's acting as the lending institution. So after closing, the buyer is going to be paying the seller directly. We got a form for that, or seller financing addendum. And then if it's new construction, there may be a building deposit. And again, we have instructions to use our new construction addendum. So again, when we need to use an addendum, the contract is really good about alerting us. They're letting us know, ooh, stop, you need an addendum. So we've gone through, really what happens here is we take this top line, this purchase price, minus all the lines in between. And this very last line here is the balance of the purchase price in cash at settlement, some or all which may be paid with the proceeds of a new loan. Now, in all my years, I cannot imagine a situation where every single one of these lines is filled out. You're not going to have a loan assumption, seller financing, new construction, due diligence. You're not going to use all of these. So these would be a great place. Don't leave a blank blank. If one of these blanks doesn't apply, let's be clear and make sure we all understand that that amount due is 0. Acknowledge the blank, and anything with a dollar sign in front of it, put a 0. The other thing I have to say about this section, just make sure, especially as we start negotiating and back and forth, and we're talking about different purchase prices and due diligence and earnest monies and back and forth and back and forth, make sure the final agreed upon terms before we sign this contract, make sure your math is right. Make sure that the top line minus all the lines in between equal that bottom line. So whip your calculator out, make sure that subtracts out. Questions on our purchase price section? Just to point out, bottom of page 1, I am a member of NCAR, so I can use forms that rock capital R Realtor. We're reminded that this form is jointly approved by the North Carolina Bar Association's Real Property Section and the North Carolina Association of Realtors, NCAR. We have our Equal Housing Opportunity logo. We've identified the form, standard form 2T, and then we have the revision, so we know that we're using the most current form. Again, this is a problem that's gone away with electronic documents. Today, when they update the forms, .loop, for example, they have a relationship with NCAR. So as long as you're in good standing member, that sync is going to happen almost seamlessly. Once they hit that switch, you'll be able to have access to and see the updated forms. Once upon a time ago, it wasn't that easy. Agents would print out contracts and carry around with them in their trunk, right? So they'd always be ready to write an offer up. I still don't think that's a bad idea, but you know, the problem is, and then the form would update and they print out 10 more contracts and put those in their trunk. And then next year, 10 more contracts. We always like to put pre-printed forms in our trunk, but we never like to take them out. So now all of a sudden you have years and years and years of contracts in your trunk and you're trying to figure out which is the most current. So again, electronic transactions, documents help keep us a little better organized. If you want to carry forms in your trunk, I'm not opposed to that, right? Carry something around in your trunk just in case, but just make sure what's in your trunk is the most current form. Top of page 2, we have a blue note. This addresses kind of our Cash App situation. Again, I think they're embellishing a little bit. This might be the section they're embellishing it on. But right now it says that the parties agree that buyer will pay any fee or deposit described above by electronic or wire transfer. Seller agrees to cooperate in effecting such transfer, including the establishment of any necessary account and providing any necessary information to the buyer, provided, however, that the buyer shall be responsible for additional costs, if any, associated with the transfer. So if there's a fee to do that Cash App, for example, the contract says that the buyer is going to be responsible for paying those additional costs. Should, getting scroll happy here. Should the buyer fail to deliver either the due diligence fee or the initial earnest money deposit by their due dates were defined for us on page 1. So should either be late, or should any check or other funds paid by the buyer be dishonored for any reason by the institution upon which the payment is drawn. Let me stop here for a second. We're saying the payment's being dishonored. What happened to that check? It bounced high, didn't it? So if it's dishonored, the check is bounced. So either it's late or it's dishonored. Please understand, you guys, due diligence fee and earnest money deposit do not affect the validity of a contract. Neither one is required for a valid contract. If we do agree to due diligence and initial earnest money, now the party's contractually obligated to deliver it after the contract date. So this is addressing what if it's late or what if it bounces. The seller may be able to terminate, but they gotta follow a certain set of steps, a certain set of guidelines. If it's late or if it bounces, the buyer shall have 1 banking day after written notice to deliver readily available funds to the payee. In this case, the payee is the seller. You do not see personal check here. Your check already bounced. I don't want another personal check from you. Now I want cash, official bank check, wire transfer, electronic transfer. The seller has to give written notice saying that this is late or it bounced. And after that written notice, the seller has to give the buyer 1 banking day. So if we don't have it in time, the seller just can't terminate. They need to make sure that they are given that written notice and then giving 1 banking day for the buyer to get these readily available funds. If the buyer then does not timely deliver the funds, seller shall have the right to terminate this contract upon written notice to the buyer. A seller shall be entitled to due diligence fee along with the earnest money paid or to be paid in the future. I have a form. I mean, an email is written notice, right? So that's sufficient. But the commission, or not the commission, NCAR does have a form that we can use if you're the listing agent and you haven't received this money yet, or it's bounced. We do have a form that we can look at. Seller may be entitled to recover reasonable attorney fees as described in paragraph 23 for the parties' rights to attorney fees and trying to collect the earnest money deposit or the due diligence fee. Basic contract law says any legally binding contract has the provisions about what happens if some party breaches. And once upon a time ago, they had it scattered all throughout the contract. I think 2 years ago, they created paragraph 23. And when we see that, it's going to see it actually spells out. This is remedy for the seller if the buyer breaches. This is remedy for the buyer if the seller breaches. And this is how we're going to have to handle attorney fees, court costs, if we got to take anybody to court. So it's just referencing us to that paragraph. Still defining things. We got the earnest money deposit, the initial earnest money deposit, the additional earnest money deposit, and any other earnest monies paid or required to be paid are collectively going to be known as the earnest money deposit. These are going to be deposited promptly and held in an escrow agent until closing, at which time it will be, what did we say? Credited to the buyer, or until this contract is otherwise terminated. In the event the offer is not accepted or a condition of any resulting contract is not satisfied, the earnest money deposit shall be refunded to the buyer. Again, we're instructed to see that paragraph 23. Couple things here. You may be asked in the throes of negotiations to hang on to your buyer's earnest money deposit until and if a contract is formed. If that offer never becomes a contract, then that buyer doesn't owe that money. The buyer doesn't owe any money until we have a contract. So if the offer is not accepted, the buyer's not out. We need to make sure we get their earnest money deposit back. Or the condition of the resulting contract is not satisfied. That's referring to our due diligence period. We'll see that spelled out a little bit better. By the way, you guys as provisional brokers, you cannot walk around with somebody else's money. So if your buyer says, here's my earnest money deposit, will you hang on to this for me while we're negotiating? As PBs, you've got to take it to your BIC. PBs cannot walk around with somebody else's money. Full brokers should not walk around with somebody else's money. Bottom line, you guys, if you have somebody else's money in your possession, who do you think's responsible for it? Yep, you. So my suggestion, if somebody hands you money, my suggestion is to get it to where it needs to go. Get it out of your possession. Defining the escrow agent who's going to hold the earnest money. We're going to insert a name. The name we're going to put in here is the name of the firm. May it be the real estate firm or the closing attorney's firm. Don't put the individual agent or the individual attorney, whatever the firm name is. Buyer and seller consent to disclose by the escrow agent of any material facts pertaining to the earnest money deposit to the parties of the transaction, their agent, and their lender. So we got to keep the escrow agent informed about anything that could affect the earnest money deposit. We have a blue note talking about disputes. So before we look at this, let's talk about when earnest money might be in dispute. We all know what this contract says. We're going to see what this contract says. If we terminate within due diligence, the seller keeps the due diligence fee, the buyer gets their earnest money back. If we terminate after due diligence, the seller gets both. We're going to spell all that out in contract. So when the parties enter into this, they're already contractually agreeing. If I terminate, I get it. If you don't, I don't, right? I mean, we're already agreeing what's going to happen if we terminate. But here's the deal. The escrow agent is acting as an impartial third party. They're not here to read the contract or dictate the law. If the parties terminate, the parties have to have a signed written release of the earnest money. Both parties have to release it. And if either party isn't going to release it, then the earnest money is in dispute. So even though that's what the contract says, and we all know it, and an attorney may be the escrow agent that has legalities to do that, but understanding they're acting as that impartial third party. And if either party isn't willing to release that earnest money in writing, then it's in dispute. And that's what this note is covering. So in the event of dispute over the disposition of the earnest money, a licensed broker is required by state law, an escrow agent if it's not a broker, to retain the earnest money deposit in their trust account until the escrow agent has obtained a written release from the parties consenting to its disposition, or until disbursement is ordered by a court of competent jurisdiction. If a broker or attorney licensed to practice law is holding the earnest money, the broker or attorney may deposit the disputed monies with the appropriate clerk of courts in accordance with this North Carolina general statute. So if the parties are in dispute, the escrow agent's going to try, they're going to send letters, maybe even certified mail, trying to do something about it. And if either party is still unwilling to sign, somebody's angry and digging their heels in, right? I'm not going to sign that. At some point, the escrow agent will eventually turn it over to the clerk of courts and let the two go downtown and hash it out. The thing that we need to understand is they can't make that decision if the parties don't agree to release it. Comments on that? There's termination forms. There's just as many termination forms as there are. But there's termination with release of earnest money, termination without release of earnest money, various forms for various termination situations.
I do have a quick question.
Yeah.
It's actually just in general, not about the form, but
Sure.
what's the standard rate that most people will put down for earnest money? Is there a certain kind of rule?
Unfortunately, Sharon, no, we don't have like a formula. The answer to that, the commission tries to be helpful. Y'all want to know what the commission says about how much earnest money and how much due diligence? They say whatever the buyer is willing to offer and the seller is willing to accept. So I wish we had a formula. You know, if the purchase price was X amount and we take 5%, but there isn't, because it is one of those completely negotiable deals, whatever the buyer is willing to offer and the seller is willing to accept. I think a lot of times it's driven by the market. I mean, this is why in the last couple of years, we've been hearing about due diligence and earnest money fees. I'm talking 5-digit fees. I've heard of some 6-digit fees. My question is, where the heck are these people that are getting 6-digit fees for due diligence and or earnest money? Those are the people I want to meet. They got that kind of money laying around. But we're seeing with this market, with this pendulum, we're starting to see those due diligence and earnest monies come down. And when that pendulum swings back and the buyers are in control and the buyers are in the driver's seat, at the height of the buyer's market, we might be seeing $100 due diligence and $50 earnest money. You know, it's going to be, for example, the complete other end of the spectrum. So it's just driven by the market. It's driven by what's going on right now. As buyers agents, we need to make sure we're having these conversations with our buyers about what happens to the due diligence and the earnest money, making sure they understand. Bottom line, when working with buyers, it comes down to their risk tolerance, doesn't it? And sometimes helping the buyer figure out, what are you willing to lose? If you don't buy this home, what are you okay with losing? And trying to be competitive in the market. Then for the escrow agent, I got something in all caps. Parties agree that a brokerage firm acting as an escrow agent may place the earnest money deposit in an interest-bearing trust account, and that any interest earned shall be dispersed to the escrow agent monthly in consideration with the expenses incurred by maintaining such account records associated therewith. It's a common question I get in pre-licensing. Can the earnest money be in an interest-bearing account? Sure, as long as it's in the contract. And if we're using standard form 2T, sure, it can be an interest-bearing account. That interest is property of the escrow agent. So each month that they accrue interest, they'll just need to transfer that from their trust account to their operating account. Still defining things. Here's our effective date. This is a good review from what we talked about yesterday, that magic moment in time when it goes from being an offer to a contract. So we need 2 things to happen. We need the last one buyer and seller has signed or initialed the offer or final counter offer. And 2, such signing or initialing is communicated to the party making the offer. So the effective date of the contract is that magic moment in time. We have the last one to sign, the last offeree to sign, and then communication of acceptance crosses our communication wall and goes back to the party making the offer. That is the effective date of this contract. Again, most of the time, this can all happen on the same day. But if you're in the throes of negotiations, you get this thing signed at 11:55 p.m., but you don't communicate that signature until 12:01 a.m., your effective date is going to be that 12:01 date, that next day. So communicating that acceptance as soon as you know it's signed helps everything to happen on the same day. You know what that effective date is. The parties acknowledge and agree that the initial lines are merely evidence if they haven't reviewed each page. I'm going to go back up for 1 second. If we look at the bottom of every page, we have a place for the buyers and the sellers to initial. This is on page 1, 2, 3, 4, all of the pages. And what that little blip is saying is that these initials don't affect the validity of the contract. If they don't initial any page, but they sign the last page, we're under contract. What we need is that signature at the end. The only thing they're acknowledging by the initial boxes that they've seen and understood page 1. They've seen and understood page 2. Again, one of these things in electronic documents we're just not dealing with. Back in the day when we were using paper, we had all this stupid sticky sign here tabs on everything, every page. And those things are easy to fall off, right? And an initial box or something could get passed by. Today, you and I are control. We're setting these forms up to send for e-signatures. So we can make sure there's initial boxes for our parties on each page. Now we're going to define our due diligence fee, and our due diligence period. So first, defining due diligence. What the heck is due diligence? Due diligence is the buyer's opportunity to investigate the property and the transaction contemplated by this contract, including but not necessarily limited to the matters described, paragraph 4 below, to decide whether the buyer in their sole discretion will proceed with or terminate this transaction. Due diligence is the answer to North Carolina being a caveat emptor state. It doesn't seem fair that the seller doesn't have to disclose anything, does it? And so the buyer then is given this opportunity to investigate the property. The buyer is given this period of time to learn as much about the property as they possibly can, to decide, now knowing what I know, do we want to proceed with or terminate this transaction? Accompanying due diligence is going to be the due diligence fee. So we're told the due diligence fee is a negotiated amount, if any, paid by the buyer to the seller with connection to this contract for the buyer's right to terminate this contract for any reason or no reason during the due diligence period. The buyer is paying the seller for the right to terminate. Maybe they have a really good reason. Maybe they get a home inspection report with a whole lot of things wrong. Structural, electrical, plumbing. Did you guys just hear a lot of dollar signs, right? This got really expensive. The roof is 30 years old. This got really expensive really fast. And the buyer may say, I can buy the house, but I don't have that kind of money to put in right now. They have that right to terminate. They have a reason or no reason. They literally could wake up tomorrow and say, nah, I don't want to buy this house. That is what the buyer is paying the seller for, is the right to terminate. There's a common misconception out there amongst buyers and sellers that the buyer's paying that due diligence fee for the seller to take their home off the market and not allow any more showings. And that's not true. The seller can still have showings. They could still leave it open for showings. They could accept a backup offer if they wanted to. That's one of the forms that we'll look at. So the contract defines the due diligence fee is the buyer's right to terminate for any reason or no reason during the due diligence period. It shall be the property of the seller upon the effective date and shall be, there it is again, a credit to the buyer at closing. Due diligence fee is non-refundable, except in the event of a material breach of this contract by the seller, or if this contract is terminated under paragraph 23B, we'll get there, or otherwise provided in any addendum. Buyer and seller expressly waive any right they have to deny the right to conduct due diligence or to assert any defense as to the enforceability of this contract based on the absence or alleged insufficiency of the due diligence. It being the intent of the parties to create a legally binding contract, the sale of the property without regard to any amount or any existence of. Again, what we're saying here is it's a negotiated amount, if any, whatever the buyer is willing to offer and the seller is willing to accept. So if the buyer offers 0 and the seller accepts 0, we have created a legally binding contract with 0 due diligence fee. So even if that amount is 0, what that last section there is saying is that's what the parties agreed to. If the buyer terminates within due diligence, they have exercised that right to terminate. The seller will get to keep the due diligence fee. That's what they were paid for to begin with. But the buyer paid for that right, which means the seller can't take them to court. they were paid money. They accepted that, acknowledging that the buyer could terminate for any reason or no reason. And then we have our due diligence period, the period beginning on the effective date, extending through 5 p.m. on, put an actual date in there. Time being of the essence, drop dead date and time. Again, how much time do we allow for due diligence period? It's all negotiable. Buyer's agents, we want to make sure we have enough time to get our inspections done, to get that appraisal done so we can see what it appraises for. We may not have loan approval while we're coming out of due diligence, but at least we have a good idea from the lender about how that loan is going. This could be affected by the market. You know, when real estate agents are super busy, guess what? Our home inspectors, our appraisers, our lenders, everybody else is really busy as well. So if we're slow, if we're busy, we may need to adjust time. Buyer's agents, if your buyer's getting a loan, if you're familiar with the lender, you know their process, you know about how much time they need to process the loan. But if it's a new lender that you've never worked with before, I would suggest picking up the phone and calling them and asking them, how much time do you need to get that appraisal back? How much time due diligence do you need? So it's all completely negotiable, driven by the market. Money talks, doesn't it? So I think more due diligence fee may get your buyer some more due diligence time. Don't offer me $50 and ask for 5 weeks. That's not going to get you far. Questions on our due diligence fee, or due diligence period? Okay. Let's take a break. We come back, go to page 322. Welcome back. Any questions on the first couple pages of the contract? We're still defining things. We spend a lot of time just explaining what these things mean. I usually point that first section out to my buyers and sellers. I think if they're going to look at anything, I think that helps them better understand the process. But again, I can't just hand them something and say, read this, because I know that's probably not going to happen. So I still think it is definitely part of my duty, worth that time to explain it to them, to have that conversation. The other thing I want to remind you guys, we looked yesterday at the commission's website, that publications tab, some of those Q&A brochures. There's a Q&A brochures on closing. There's one on due diligence. There's one on earnest money. So if you find that you're saying the same thing over and over again, or if you have a buyer or the seller that's having a hard time understanding, we have resources available that we can send to them to help them better understand it. So utilize what you got. Moving right along, page 3, we're going to talk about that difference in settlement and closing. We're going to define settlement. We're going to define closing. Like we said the other day, what our buyers and sellers actually attend is settlement. So settlement is defined as the proper execution and delivery to the closing attorney of all documents necessary to complete the transaction, including the deed, settlement statement, deed of trust, and other loan or conveyance documents, and the closing attorney's receipt of all funds necessary to complete this transaction. So settlement is when the buyers and sellers go to the attorney's office, sign their paperwork. The buyer will bring their funds to settlement. If the seller owes any money, that's when they will take their funds as well. Settlement date, the parties agree that settlement will take place on, and we're going to put a specific date. So whatever day we're shooting for, understanding delays happen. I have a note here about delays. We'll look at paragraph 12 that addresses delays and how those may happen. I always tell my parties to have a plan B, because if something happens and we can't close on this date, I don't want them sleeping in the U-Haul tonight. I want them to be, comfortable in a bed somewhere, not in the back of a truck. So we define settlement, and then we define closing. Closing's what happened when you and I leave settlement. Closing is the completion of the legal process, which results in the transfer of title to the property from the seller to the buyer. Closing includes the following steps. Closing consists of settlement that we defined above, the completion of satisfactory title update to the property following settlement, the closing attorney's receipt and authorization to disperse all necessary funds, and the fourth and final act of closing, recordation in the appropriate county register of the deed and the deed of trust, if any, which shall take place as soon as reasonably possible for the closing attorney after settlement. So once we leave, the attorney's going to put their finishing touches on everything. They're going to do that last quick title search. They're going to offer their title opinion to the title insurance company, so we can have a satisfactory title update and originate the title insurance. The closing attorney's receipt of all necessary funds. Well, we collected the money from the buyer at settlement, and any money, if applicable, from the seller at settlement. So now at closing, the funds that the attorney's selecting or receiving is going to be the lender's funds coming in. So once we leave settlement, the attorney sends that final loan package, that signed loan package, back to the lender. Upon the lender's approval, that's when the lender will release their funds. And then the last act is recording that new deed down at the Register of Deeds and the property where the county is located. Everybody works really hard for settlement and closing to happen on the same day. I know a lot of attorneys now won't schedule settlement. The latest they'll schedule is 3 o'clock, for example. So that gives us time to get everything signed. They can get the funds from the lender, and still hit the record button down at the Register of Deeds before 5 p.m. Register of Deeds closes at 5. They're not going to stay open until 5:01, waiting on us to record something. So at 5 o'clock, they shut down and they're done for the day. Understanding though, I mean, we're e-recording these deeds. So here we go with the what ifs. What if the power goes out? What if the internet goes down? You know, there may be a case where we just can't record the deed because we can't get it down there by 5 p.m. The internet won't come back on before 5 p.m. So again, it's going to take place as soon as reasonably possible for the closing attorney. Upon closing, the proceeds of the sale shall be dispersed by the closing attorney in accordance to the settlement statement. That's that ALTA we looked at yesterday on provisions of this North Carolina general statute. If the title update should reveal unexpected liens, encumbrances, or other title defects, or if the attorney is not authorized to disperse all necessary funds, then the closing is going to be suspended and settlement will be delayed under paragraph 12 when we talk about delaying settlement. So again, it's worth telling everybody, just have a plan B. There's a lot can happen. There's a lot that needs to happen. And in the event the unexpected happens, we're making sure everybody's safe. Questions between the difference in settlement and closing? Here's our first red warning. The North Carolina State Bar has determined that the performance of most acts and services required for a closing constitutes the practice of law and must be performed only by an attorney licensed to practice law in North Carolina. State law prohibits unlicensed individuals or firms from rendering legal services or advice. Although non-attorney settlement agents may perform limited services in connection with the closing, they may not perform all acts and services required to complete a closing. Closing involves significant legal issues that should be handled by an attorney. It is the position of the North Carolina Bar Association and NCAR that all buyers should hire an attorney licensed in North Carolina to perform a closing. So yesterday we talked about the different meeting methods. Other states use an escrow agent, a title agent. North Carolina is a settlement meeting method. We use an attorney. So when you have a buyer coming in from Texas, at some point in the transaction, that buyer is going to look at you and say, do I have to hire an attorney? And our answer is, if the property is located in the state of North Carolina, yep, because we are a settlement meeting method state. We are an attorney closed state. The last thing we're just defining for now is special assessments. We're going to talk more about special assessments throughout the contract. So right now we're just going to define what that is. A charge against the property by a governmental authority, in addition to this year's taxes and reoccurring government service fees levied with such taxes, or by an owners association in addition with any regular assessments. So the big picture of a special assessment. Special assessments pay for improvement to the property. And a special assessment can come from the government. Maybe, for example, they're going to install street lighting in the neighborhood or sidewalks. They may put a special assessment on the homeowners whose property that's affected and let them pay a part of it. You may also have a special assessment from your HOA. If it's, for example, a condo or a townhome HOA, maybe it's time to redo the roofs or the siding or repave the parking lot. Again, these are charges above and beyond taxes and HOA dues. That blue note is telling us where we can find each party's respective responsibility for the special assessments. So just defining it now, we'll see who's responsible for what in paragraph 6A and 8K. Terms and definitions. Always a great place to start with the contract, getting that basic understanding of what does this mean? Comments? Terms and definitions. Second provision is our fixtures and exclusions. Starts with a big red warning. All caps and bold. I don't know how they can make it more important. The party should not assume, I hate that word, that an item will or will not be included in the sale based on an oral or written statement or understanding that is not part of this contract. Buyer and seller should be specific when negotiating what items will be included or excluded from the sale. So it's kind of piggybacking our parole evidence rule. Fixtures are included in the purchase price as part of the sale, free of liens unless excluded below. So fixtures are included, they convey, and unless excluded, they'll be part of the purchase price. Specified items. Buyer and seller agree that the following items, if present on the property on the date of the offer, shall be included in the sale as part of the purchase price, free of liens unless excluded below. All items listed below include both traditional and smart versions and any exclusively dedicated related equipment and or remote control devices. I think the best example I have of that is the garage door opener. That thing just clips onto the visor on your car, right? Do you know how easy it is for the seller to drive off into the sunset after closing with the garage door opener still stuck to the visor of their car? I mean, that thing's about as personal property as it gets, right? Couldn't you even just slip it in your pocket? But because that garage door opener controls the garage door that's considered a fixture, listing agents, just make sure you remind the seller that it's on their visor and they need to leave it before they start heading to California and have to overnight it back or something. Save everybody some time. Smart versions, again, technology is moving a little bit faster than the law. Our homes are getting really smart, aren't they? We got our Ring doorbells, we got smart refrigerators, we got all sorts of things now that we can hook up to apps. So when we talk about fixtures, we're including traditional and smart versions. And then the offer to purchase and contract gives us a list. If you are using standard form 2T, these are considered fixtures. If you are using another offer to purchase and contract, the fixture list might look a little bit different. So just be familiar with the fixture list of the form that you're using. I highly recommend you guys look at this fixture list before next Sunday afternoon. Okay. So look over this list, be familiar. I do know we're going to get a change to the fixture list. They're going to add, they always add. So the new fixture coming on July 1st is going to be attached exercise equipment. I don't know why it has to be added, because if it's attached, it's already a fixture, but evidently there's been an issue somewhere. You know, you can run out to Costco and get like a weight bench or something. If you bolt that thing to the floor of the wall, it becomes a fixture. So we're just specifying that, adding that. I've always heard if it winds up on the fixture list, it's the result of a lawsuit. So buyer shows up after closing, something they thought was going to be there is not. Boom, it's on the fixture list. So obviously exercise equipment has been the hot topic. Attached exercise equipment has been the hot topic button. So familiar with the list for contract. We're looking it over before next Sunday afternoon. Unpairing or deleting data from devices. Prior to closing, the seller needs to unpair any devices that will convey from personal property devices, such as your hubs, intelligent virtual assistants, mobile devices, vehicles, etc. This is our smart homes that we're referring to, with which they were paired. Delete personal data from any device that will convey and restore all devices to factory default settings unless otherwise agreed. Seller's obligation under this paragraph shall survive closing. So if they forget to unpair their phone from their Ring doorbell and they realize it after closing, they still have a duty to unpair from their Ring doorbell. So again, listing agents, as we're learning all the smart features of our listing of our seller's home, make sure they understand that. Funny story. This C here that we're looking at was just kind of embellished, enhanced on 2 years ago, the revision. I had the opportunity to take a forms class with a lady that's on the forms committee. It was an interesting class. That's the lady I want to take to lunch one day, because I want to know more about how the forms committee comes. So anyway, the forms committee lady taught the class. Y'all ready for this? They had to add C because they were having problems with sellers throughout the state, I'm sure the country. After closing, something didn't go their way. Everybody gets a little petty. So after closing, they were driving up and down the house and turning stuff on and on, opening the garage door, turning the lights on and off, you know, so buyers are sitting at their new homes and sellers are sitting out front messing with them. You can't make this stuff up. So to address that, they've added this verbiage, making the seller contractually obligated to unpair, so they can't come through in the middle of the night and open the garage door or whatever they were doing. Petty, petty, petty. Blue note says any fixture or other item described in subparagraph A and B that will not be part of the sale should be identified in paragraphs below as applicable. So the paragraphs below. Items leased or not owned. The seller can't convey what's not theirs. So if there's something that the seller's making payments on, they've leased but not owned, such as, they give us some examples: antennas, satellite dishes, receivers, appliances, alarm and security system must be identified here and shall not convey. I've had situations, for example, CPI. The sellers had CPI. My buyer said, we want CPI. We made one phone call and CPI allowed them to transfer. So equipment didn't have to change. They just had to sign a contract saying we take the equipment, they allowed to transfer. If there's something leased or not owned that the buyer wants, it might be worth the conversation as that. But otherwise, the seller can't convey what's not theirs. Also addressed under this items leased or not owned in paragraph 7D, we got some last year new verbiage about fuel tanks. So we'll cover that. And then there's other items that do not convey. So if the sellers are going to take any fixtures, and they won't take them before you list. If there are any fixtures that the seller's going to take that the buyer has seen, if they're in the MLS pictures, right? I mean, let's be honest, guys, in a perfect world, the seller will take the fixture down before we ever list the property. The buyer will never see it. Do we live in a perfect world? Nah. Sometimes the seller says, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to take it down until I move. So listing agents, we need to make sure that those fixtures the seller's going to take is in this provision of the contract.
A major thing with that is those big freezers that people have. They use them clear up until the day of closing or the day they move out. And people think that they're getting those freezers because they're part of the appliances.
Because they're part of the appliances. That's great, Kelly. But that's not listed in the fixture list. Those big deep freezers, is that what you're talking about down in the basement and stuff? Yep, yep. That's great. That thing is, it's like the refrigerator, right? It too is personal property. If the seller's taken any fixtures, they shall repair any damage caused by removal of any excluded items. So they just can't jerk the ceiling fan out of the ceiling and leave a big hole in the ceiling. They need to repair the hole. Maybe the buyer and seller can agree that the seller is going to replace that ceiling fan with something else, right? I mean, if we're dealing with fixtures, hopefully our little red flag is going up, because there's a really good chance we need to find out some more information. The thing that we're looking at here is that we're listing things that do not convey, fixtures that will not be there when that new deed is recorded. Top of page 5, we address personal property. Following personal property present on the property on the day of this offer shall be transferred to the buyer at no value, at closing at no value. Here, we need to be specific. List 2-door stainless steel Whirlpool refrigerator. If you can get to the model number, sometimes when you open the doors, the model's on one of the inside door covers. Obviously, the model is on the back of the refrigerator. We are not expected to move the refrigerator, scratch up the floor so we can get that model number. But if you can get to it, it'll help identify that refrigerator. Please be specific. I have heard stories over the years of agents putting in refrigerator. Buyer shows up after settlement. In the kitchen is a little 2-shelf dorm room fridge. Did the seller do what they were contractually obligated to do? Did they leave a refrigerator? Probably wasn't the one the buyer was envisioning. You know, to Kelly's point, if you say refrigerator and there's the nice one with the ice maker in the kitchen, and then there's the not so nice one in the garage that's their drink refrigerator, the seller could leave either one of them and say, we left a fridge. So please be specific. I know the contract says on the date of the offer. I have a concern with that, because what if they switch it out the day after and it becomes a he said, she said thing? So saying the day on the offer, we almost need proof that this was the refrigerator when we made this offer, because otherwise it's going to be hard to prove. You may want to snap a picture of the refrigerator so you have that date and time stamp. But again, I would pretend that this contract is going to wind up in the hands of the judge. The judge has never seen the home, seen the refrigerator in question, nothing. The judge needs to be able to look at this contract and identify exactly what refrigerator we're talking about. Does that make sense? So be clear. Buyer's agents, be very clear on behalf of your buyer. So we're getting them the right fridge. Washer, dryer, same thing. Our blue note here says all personal or any personal property that was part of the sale should be identified in this paragraph. Buyers advised to consult with their lender to assure that the personal property items listed above can be included in this contract. So again, when your buyer's starting the laundry list of the stuff that they want, I want the fridge, I want the washer and dryer, I want the dining room suite, I want the John Deere green tractor. That's hard. They start rattling all this stuff off that they want. That's when our flag needs to go up. We may need to contact the lender. Remember, the lender's giving a loan to buy the property, not the stuff. The lender may have a hard time financing the dining room set and taking 30 years to getting it paid back. Does that make sense? So if there's any question about the personal property, just reach out to the lender. Questions on fixtures or personal property? So we're going to get to provision 4. Buyer's agents. Provisions 4, 5, and 6 are about the buyer. So if you're a buyer's agent, if you're helping a buyer, these are the ones that we specifically want to make sure we point out, have the conversation about. 4, 5, and 6 are all about the buyer. Provision 4 is about the buyer's due diligence process. A lot of this we've already talked about in chapter 12, so we're not doing this word for word, just a nice review. However, word for word, I see a big red warning, bold, and all caps. I think this is important, so we're going to take a minute and look at this warning. Buyer is strongly encouraged to conduct due diligence during the due diligence period. If the buyer is not satisfied with the results or the progress of their due diligence, buyer should terminate this contract prior to the expiration of the due diligence period, unless the buyer can obtain a written extension from the seller. Can the buyer ask for an extension of due diligence? Can we ask for more time? Sure. What's the next sentence say though? Seller is not obligated to grant an extension. We can always ask, but there's no guarantee that the seller will grant that extension. What's one thing that may make the seller give you more time? Trinity says, give them more money. If you want more time, maybe we consider offering more additional due diligence fee. We got an agreement to amend the contract that we'll look at next weekend. So we'll see where we can do that. Buyer may continue to investigate the property following the expiration of the due diligence period. Let me stop there and make sure we're good. Understand, at the end of due diligence, the buyer has not lost their right to investigate and inspect. The buyer is investigating and inspecting up until the day of settlement. The final walkthrough is an opportunity to invest and investigate. So due diligence does not lose that right to learn about the property. What the buyer loses at the end of due diligence is the right to terminate for any reason or no reason. They should be, and usually are, still continuing to learn things up until settlement. They've just lost that right to terminate. Buyer's failure to deliver a termination notice to the seller prior to the expiration of the due diligence period will constitute a waiver by buyer of any right to terminate based on any other matter relating to buyer's due diligence. Provided, however, following the due diligence period, buyer may still exercise the right to terminate if the seller fails to materially comply with their obligations that are going to be listed under paragraph 8, or for any other reason permitted under the terms of this contract in North Carolina law. So we've explained what the due diligence period is for. We've explained the buyer's right to terminate. We told them they can ask for an extension, but the seller's under no obligation. And understanding that they can continue to investigate. They have not lost that right to investigate. The only thing they lose is the right to terminate. If they terminate after due diligence, they will suffer the consequences of breach. In addition to losing the due diligence, they'll lose their earnest money. Then we got a whole laundry list of what the buyer should consider doing during their due diligence. And the first thing listed, the first thing to take into consideration is if we have to get loan approval. So the buyer at the buyer's expense shall be entitled to pursue qualification for and approval of the loan, if any. Our blue note says there is no loan or appraisal contingency in this offer to purchase and contract. I have no built-in contingencies in this contract. The parties could add a loan contingency. They could add, the last few years, we've had an appraisal gap contingency. Starting to see that go away a little bit. So they can add it, but there is not one in this offer to purchase and contract. Buyers advised to consult with their lender prior to signing this offer to assure the due diligence period allows for sufficient time for the loan process and for the buyer's lender to provide buyers sufficient information to decide whether to terminate or move forward with this transaction. It's very rare that we have final loan approval while we're in due diligence. In all my years, I've only known one buyer to have that final loan approval. So what's going to happen is hopefully during due diligence, we can get the buyer at least through the first round of underwriting. When we're going through for loan approval, it's not uncommon for the loan to come out of underwriting the first time with the lender requesting more information. Not uncommon at all. And while we don't have final approval while in due diligence, usually what we can get from the lender is a pretty good idea. So we get out the first round of underwriting. We've had that appraisal done. We know what else the lender needs, what other documents they need from the borrower. Buyer's agents near the end of due diligence, near the end of this process, it may not be a bad idea to call the lender and say, I understand you can't give me guarantees, but how's it looking? What's that pretty good idea? Are things looking good, assuming the buyer just submits his paperwork, or are things not looking good? That's what we mean by a pretty good idea. Based on that, the buyer has a decision to make. Do I terminate or do I proceed with this transaction? Talking to the buyer about their property investigation. Buyer or buyer's agents or representatives at the buyer's expense. Remember, the buyer's going to pay for any property investigation during their due diligence, shall be entitled to conduct all tests, surveys, appraisals, investigations, examinations, and inspections on the property as the buyer deems appropriate, including but not limited to. So here's our laundry list of things that the buyer should consider doing so they can learn about the property and due diligence. So there's our inspections, includes our home inspection, pest inspection, review of documents, covenants, bylaws, etc. if we're in an HOA. Insurance, homeowners insurance, need to get that secure. Remembering that the lender has to approve the buyer's new homeowners insurance policy. So we want to make sure we have an applicable and appropriate insurance. There's our appraisal, survey, zoning, government regulations. Is it in a flood hazard? Utilities, who's going to provide us utilities? Streets and roads, are the roads public or private? If they are private, when we say about streets being public or private, I'm not saying whether or not you can drive on it. When we talk about streets being public or private, what we're saying is who maintains it. So public roads will be maintained by the North Carolina Department of Transportation. Private roads will be maintained by the homeowners. They're more than likely in an HOA. How are we going to pay for a pothole? Is it part of our dues? Are you going to do a special assessment every time we have a pothole? So we want to help the buyer find out. Special assessments. So again, just a laundry list. Remembering this list is not inclusive, not limited to. So another one of my super simple philosophies, if it's important to my buyer, then it's important to me. So if your buyer wants to inspect or investigate something, please do not look at them and say, nah, you don't need to worry about that. It'll be fine. If it's important to them, then it's our job to help them get that information, get those inspections. Still under the buyer's due diligence process, is there a sale or a lease of existing property? Is identified in paragraph 5B below, unless otherwise provided in an addendum. This contract is not conditioned upon the sale or lease or closing of other property owned by the buyer. Therefore, if the buyer must sell or lease other real property in order to qualify for a new loan or otherwise complete the purchase, buyer should seek to close on buyer's other property prior to the end of the due diligence period, or be reasonably satisfied that closing on buyer's other property will take place prior to settlement date of this contract. There are no contingencies. They can agree to add a contingency, but this is telling us it is not contingent. If the parties agree to add a contingency, we will need an attorney to draft something up. I do not have a pre-printed contingent sale form. We used to. You may find one running around out there or laying around out there, but they retired that form 4 or 5 years ago. So if you come across a contingent sale addendum, it's a retired form and we can't use it anymore, which means we need to have an attorney draft something. So we'll address that below in paragraph 5B. Repair improvements, negotiations, agreement. Buyer acknowledges and understands the following. Unless the parties agree otherwise, here it is. I think this is about the most important sentence in this offer to purchase and contract. This property is being sold in its current condition. If you're using 2T, this house is as is. If the seller agrees to do any repairs, anything, if they agree to change a light bulb, we need to amend that sentence. Because now this property is being sold with the understanding that the seller will change the light bulb. So if the seller agrees to do any repairs, we have a form that we'll look at next weekend. And that form will allow us to amend that sentence. Seller may, but is not required to engage in negotiations for repairs, improvements to the property. The buyer can always ask. The worst thing that can happen is a seller can say no. The seller can't terminate because the buyer asks. Do you guys see homes sometimes? We see it sometimes that are advertised as is. In MLS, it'll say this home is as is. Have you guys seen that yet? What does that mean to you when you see that? We know it's as is. We're reading the contract. But if MLS says it's as is, what does that generally say to you?
Usually they're not wanting to do any repairs or make any changes.
That's it. They're pretty much telling you up front, aren't they, Kelly? We're not going to do it. You can't, I mean, you can ask, but we're telling you right now, no. That's the way I interpret it as well. Matthew, is that what you were gonna, how you read it?
Yeah, that's what I would say.
Again, there's still no rule that says we can't ask. I mean, if you're the buyer's agents, whose best interest do you have? It's your buyer. So there's still no rule that says we can't ask, but just know we've pretty much gotten our answer before. Buyers advised to make any repair, improvement requests in sufficient time to allow negotiations to be concluded prior to the expiration of the due diligence period. Any agreement that the parties may reach with respect to these repairs is in addition to this contract that must be writing and signed by the parties in accordance with this paragraph. Again, we have, we're told to see paragraph 8C, 8M, that both address repairs and how that's handled. We also have, they recently changed the name, so I don't remember if I'm old school or not, but I'll call it the due diligence repair an agreement. What's it called now? DDRR, due diligence repair agreement. I don't know. We'll look at it and I'll stop fumbling over it when I see it in front of me. That's what happens when they change names on you. You get a little off, but it's an amendment. It's an agreement to do repairs, to amend that one sentence. Questions so far on, we're still on 4, buyer's due diligence process. All right, let's take our last break. Just hit 4 o'clock. Let's come back in 10 and we'll wrap it up for the weekend.
Boy, that time flies by.
10 minutes goes. Just when you're getting into something, right? Unloading the dishwasher, folding towels. What else are you guys doing on that 10-minute break? Welcome back. Still under 4, buyer's due diligence. Buyer's obligation to repair damage. This is what we mentioned yesterday when we were talking about those money damages, specifically those consequential damages. For example, this says, buyer shall, at the buyer's expense, promptly repair any damage to the property resulting from any activities of buyer, buyer's agents, and contractors, but buyer shall not be responsible for any damage caused by accepted practices either approved by the North Carolina Home Inspector Licensing Board or applicable to any other NC licensed professional performing reasonable appraisals, tests, surveys, examinations, and inspections of the property. This repair obligation shall survive any termination of this contract. Once the buyer hires the home inspector, the appraiser, or they bring in the appraisal, all those people that are for the buyer, helping the buyer conduct their inspections and investigations as part of their due diligence, the buyer's responsible for any damage they may cause to the property. So let's back up. We go under contract, the buyer looks at you and says, do you have a home inspector you can recommend? Remember what I said, we're going to give them choices. We're going to give them names of people that we used in the past, or your firm, if you're still learning. But we want to make sure the people that we're recommending have a good reputation. Don't just tell your buyer to go to Google and find a home inspector, because we have no idea who they're going to find, and understanding that your buyer's responsible. If they damage that property while they're doing their home inspection, the buyer's on the hook to pay for it. And this repair obligation shall survive any termination of this contract. So the home inspector damages the property, the buyer terminates, they're not off the hook. They still have a duty to make that repair, even though they terminate the contract. When we talk about any damage caused that's due to accepted practices, there are some things that the home inspector does to show us that things aren't broke or they're not working right. The best one, the one that makes me laugh every single time, when you guys see a home inspection report and there's rotten or soft wood, maybe in the door frame or the windowsill, do y'all know how the home inspector shows this? I love it. They take their screwdriver and they jam it in there, and then they take a picture of it. They didn't damage the property, did they? They're showing that that property was already damaged. If they take their screwdriver, if that wood is good and hard, they're not going to be able to jam their screwdriver in it. That one, Mary Ellie looks, that one makes me laugh every single time when I see it. It's like, oh, look, soft wood. You got a screwdriver stuck in there. But that's how they can prove that this wood is soft. It's rotted. They didn't damage it. They're just showing, using that to show. You guys seen that yet? Kelly, you guys seen that yet? It gets me every time, every single time. I try not to laugh at home inspection reports, but come on, a screwdriver sticking out of a door frame. That's funny. Comments on that? Again, the importance of making sure that we're recommending people with reputable reputations, people you've had a good experience with in the past. If you're new, you may not know anybody yet. So in the interim, just ask your firm. Do we have a preferred vendor list? Do you have home inspectors I can recommend? Be a good way for you to start meeting some. This paragraph on indemnity, contracts, the legalese of contracts can sometimes get a little confusing. What this property is saying, if buyers indemnifying the seller, then the buyer's holding the seller harmless from all loss, damage, claims, suits, or costs. The seller's attorney may use this paragraph of this thing, and I'm not going to read this, but you guys can see this. You know, we have places in our contract where the buyer can go after the seller in court. We'll see that remedies paragraph when we get to 23 next week. You know, the contract's pretty clear, but then it's almost like they have to put this kind of catch-all in. You know, if it's not mentioned in the contract, the buyer will indemnify and hold the seller harmless from these damages. You know, this may be where the attorneys get involved. To me, it's kind of redundant because it's what we're saying scattered throughout the contract anyway. If we breach for any reason, the buyer's going to know. If the seller breaches, the buyer's going to know if they can go after the buyer or not. But otherwise, we're saying we're going to hold the seller harmless. Buyer's right to terminate. Provided that buyer has delivered any agreed upon due diligence fee, buyer shall have the right to terminate this contract. Here it is again, for any reason or no reason. All they have to do is deliver written notice of termination to the seller during the due diligence period, time being of the essence. If the buyer timely delivers the termination notice, his contract shall be terminated and the earnest money deposit shall be refunded to the buyer. If the buyer chooses to exercise their right during due diligence, all they have to do is provide written notice. Now, we have a form for that. If you want to use that, if you want to use an email, written notice is written notice. Understand, this does not obligate the buyer to tell the seller why they're terminating. Maybe the buyer wants to share that with the seller, maybe they don't. Agents, just be careful. If the buyer is choosing to tell the seller why, and they send the seller the 90-page home inspection report, buyer's agent sends it to the listing agent. Does listing agent have 90 pages of material facts on their hand? Do they have a whole laundry list of things that are wrong? We go back on the market. Now, it's not my report to give. I necessarily am not supposed to give that out. But again, don't I have in my possession a laundry list of things that are wrong that I now have to disclose? Listing agents, if you never get that report, I can't disclose what I don't know. And you can't say, I got that email, I'm not going to open it, I don't want to look at it. If you get it, you have a duty to report those material facts. Buyer's agents will like to call you. They'll see that you've been on the market, you came active again. They'll call you and say, did they have the home inspection? Yes. Can you send me that report? Remember, that report is not your property. So whether or not you can send it on or not would have to be a conversation with that buyer. That might be a reason why the buyer chooses not to share the home inspection report. But if you get it for whatever reason and you go back on the market, you now know the material facts. So they're just providing written notice, not necessarily why. Contract shall be terminated, earnest money deposit shall be refunded to the buyer. The last thing we have under the buyer's due diligence, closing shall constitute acceptance of the property in its then existing condition unless provision is otherwise made in writing. All bold, caps, pretty important. When the buyer signs at closing, at settlement, part of what they're agreeing to is they're accepting the property in its then existing condition. Let's talk about the importance of the final walkthrough, especially if you and your buyers have never seen this home vacant. We always need to do the final walkthrough before settlement. I suggest doing it as close to settlement as you can. I try to do it on our way to the attorney's office because then we've seen the property in its then existing condition. Let's say maybe we've seen this home vacant, maybe we haven't. Either way, we're going to do the final walkthrough. We go to do the final walkthrough on our way to settlement, and we walk into this room and we realize our ha-ha moment, why the seller has this big picture right here on the wall. And it's not because they're using it as their Zoom background so they don't fade into the color of the wall. It's because we're covering a really big hole. Now that the picture is gone, we see the really big hole. Everybody with me? You think this happens? Oh, yeah. Buyers pretty much have two choices at this point. They either go on to the attorney's office, sign the property and sign for the property and accept it in its then existing condition. Or we get on the horn with the listing agent, the seller, and say, we're not signing until we address this. Maybe the seller puts money in escrow, maybe they run right over with their drywall guy and fix it. I don't know what the answer to that is. But what your buyers need to understand, they got two choices. Either they go and sign and accept, or they don't until we get this resolved. It's kind of a hard decision to make, isn't it? I can't make that decision for my buyers. Another reason why I want them to have a plan B, another reason why I don't want them showing up in the U-Haul. If they show up in the U-Haul, they may not have a choice, might they? They may have to sign accepting with the big hole and just deal with it. If the seller does agree to fix it or reserve funds or whatever, keep in mind by this point, we're either on our way to or sitting in front of attorney. So if the buyers and sellers agree to anything about that hole, then we can have the attorney draft something up to make the two combined. But the buyer needs to understand if they sign and we don't address it, they go to closing, they're dealing with a big hole in their brand new house. We'll look at the seller's obligations in just or next weekend probably. And one thing we're going to learn is that the seller has a duty to remove all garbage and debris, along with any personal property that we didn't agree to. So if the seller leaves a whole bunch of trash in the house or a whole bunch of things, sometimes sellers think they're leaving gifts. If the buyer wanted them, they would have asked for them when they made the offer, right? Take your grill. If the buyer has a better grill, so take your grill. If they wanted it, they would have asked for it. Thoughts on that? I helped one of my close friends and her husband buy a house a couple years ago. And it was vacant. It was it was occupied. It was one of those that we didn't see vacant until the day of settlement. When we were looking at the home, they had the pull down attic stairs in the hall, so you pulled a string and the stairs kind of unfolded and you go up in the attic. So when we were looking before we contracted, we poked our head up there, head and shoulders. We poked our head up in the attic space to see what we were dealing with. And we noticed then that there was a lot of personal property up there, right? Just junk. Let's call it what it was. So we, okay, seller's still living there, right? They know they get it out. My girlfriend and I went to the final walkthrough. I said, let's poke our head up in the attic to make sure they got all that stuff. Poked our head up in the attic and it hadn't been touched. Nothing had been removed. Oh, hang on, this gets better. So I called the listing agent and said, your guys need to come get the stuff out of their attic. And she said, what are you talking about? They don't have stuff in the attic. That's not their stuff. Y'all want to know what we unraveled? The stuff in the attic was from the people they bought it from. They didn't know it was there. They lived there 7 years and never stuck their head in the attic. There could have been like treasures up there, y'all. We don't know. It was the previous owner's stuff. And she said, that's not their stuff. I said, well, actually it is, because they acquired it when they got the property. And I looked at my girlfriend. I said, do you want it? I said, there might be something up there. I don't know. She said, I got enough of my own stuff to deal with. I don't want somebody else's stuff. Get it out. Sellers and their agent showed up to the attorney's office. My girlfriend and I went on to breakfast, whatever. We'd done our thing. We went and got a bite to eat. They showed up. They were a little sweaty from all the work they had done coming in and out of the attic, getting all that stuff out. At least they got it to the curb for the garbage man. 7 years, and they didn't know that there was stuff in the attic. Head and shoulders. Poke your head up there every once in a while, see what's going on. Is that not unbelievable? The best part about that, the listing agent acted as the selling agent when they bought their house. So that one agent was actually one of the seller's mom. It's hard to get mad at your agent, but that's your mom. They never looked in the attic. Poke your head in places, head and shoulders. See what's up. Anything about the buyer's due diligence provision. Number 4, all about the buyer's due diligence, what they should consider doing during that time. Provision 5 is buyer representations. These are representations that the buyer's making to the seller. The seller should be able to rely on this information when deciding if they want to contract with this buyer. So the buyer's making statements, representations about various things. First off, they're going to represent the funds to complete the purchase. We're told to check if applicable. If this is a cash buyer, buyer intends to pay cash in order to purchase the property, does not intend to obtain a loan or funds from sources other than buyer's own assets. Verification of cash available for settlement is or is not attached. If you have a cash buyer, it's recommended that the buyer get a proof of funds letter from their bank. I don't need all the amount they have in their bank account, but a proof of funds letter saying they have the amount of the purchase price and any other monies that that buyer may need to bring to closing. That's what this blue note is addressing. If the buyer does not intend to obtain a new loan and or funds from sources other than buyer's own assets, seller is advised prior to signing this offer to obtain documentation from the buyer which demonstrates the buyer will be able to close on the property without the necessity of obtaining a loan or funds from sources other than the buyers. So if it's a cash buyer, we're going to represent that. Or buyer's going to get a loan or other funds. Buyer intends to obtain a loan to purchase the property from the following sources. So if it's a first mortgage loan, we want the type of loan. Is it FHA or VA? If it is FHA or VA, here's a little note to remind us to attach the FHA VA financing addendum. That's another form we'll look at next weekend. Is it conventional loan, USDA? And the principal amount of, what's the loan amount we're approved for? That should be reflective of the pre-approval letter that we're going to attach with our offer. They may be getting a second mortgage loan as well. So we're going to identify that there. Or the buyer tends to obtain funds from following other sources in order to purchase this property. There's a lot of down payment assistance programs out there right now. They may be with the county, they may be with some other source. So if your buyer is going to have the ability to take advantage of this down payment assistance program, we need to represent that to the seller. Blue note, buyer's obligation under this contract are not conditioned upon obtaining any loan or other funds from sources other than buyer's own assets. Here it is. Some mortgage loan programs and other programs providing funds by the buyer may impose repair obligations and or additional conditions or cost upon the seller or buyer, and more information may be needed. Material changes with respect to funding the purchase of the property that affects the term of this contract are material facts that must be disclosed. So I think it's important, agents, that we keep each other updated throughout the loan process. If we're going to change the loan product, maybe your buyer decides they'd be better off going FHA than conventional. We just need to keep the listing agent up to date. And specifically, if there's any of these like down program assistance that allow or require any repairs or that cost upon the seller, then we need to make sure we notify that in our offer. More information may be needed. Buyer has to represent to the seller about other property. Buyer does or does not have to sell or lease other real property in order to qualify for a new loan. We're just representing if they do or not. We're not creating a contingency. We're just giving the seller all the information. We're told to complete the following only if the buyer does have to sell or lease. So we're gonna list your other property address, what's the property you're selling or leasing. If applicable, we're gonna check if the buyer's other property is under contract as of the date of this offer. A copy of the contract has either been previously provided to the seller or accompanies this offer. We're told that the buyer can mark out confidential information of their offer, such as the purchase price, the buyer's identity, prior to providing the copy to the seller. Failure to provide a copy of the contract is not going to prevent this offer from becoming a contract. However, seller is strongly encouraged to obtain and review the contract on the buyer's property prior to accepting this offer. So we're going to represent if your other property is under contract. Our other option here is the buyer's property is not under contract, in which case we're told to check only one of the following. The property is listed with and marketed by a broker. It will be listed with and marketed by a broker, or the buyer's attempting to go for sale by owner. So we're not under contract, but we just need to identify that. The blue note reminds us that this contract is not conditioned upon the sale or lease or closing of the buyer's other property. If the parties agree to make this contract conditioned to that sale or lease, an appropriate contingency addendum should be drafted by a North Carolina real estate attorney and added to this contract. Once again, you may get your hands on a contingent sale addendum, but that form has been retired. It's no longer in place, in practice. So we can't use it. That's what it means. Performance of buyer's financial obligations. To the best of the buyer's knowledge, there are no other circumstances or conditions that would prohibit buyer from performing their financial obligations. For example, if the buyer is trying to get loan approval while facing bankruptcy or foreclosure, that kind of may slow the whole process down. That's something that the buyer should represent to the seller. That would be something that absolutely would affect their loan, their performance of their financial obligations. Still under buyer representations, the buyer is going to represent to the seller that at the time of this offer, whether or not they have or have not received the RPODs and the MOG. So we have both the different forms here spelled out to us. So the RPODs, we're told to check only one. Buyer has received a copy of the RPODs prior to making this offer and acknowledges compliance with this North Carolina general statute. I think this is the one that we see the most often because, again, you guys, at least here in the triad, the majority of the time, the RPODs is in MLS as an attachment. I think Canopy is the same way, Charlotte. So most of the time you can see that RPODs before you ever go see the property. But you do have that rare occasion, maybe this listing agent hasn't gotten in yet, maybe the seller hasn't completed it yet. So you do have the rare occasion where it's not an MLS, in which case you may want to consider calling the listing agent before you ever show the property. Hey, can you send me that RPODs real quick? We got a show and schedule for 2 o'clock tomorrow, right? So trying to get that RPODs if it's not available. Again, most of the time that it is. If it is available, we get it to our buyer when they're signing the offer, they sign the RPODs, and you have them check this box, acknowledge and assign copy of receipt. The other option here, buyer has not received a signed copy of the RPODs prior to making this offer and shall have the right to terminate or withdraw this contract without penalty. That includes a refund of a due diligence fee prior to whichever the following occurs first. So we're making an offer and we've not seen the RPODs. If we have the following end of the 3rd calendar day following receipt of the RPODs, or the end of the 3rd calendar day following the effective date, or if settlement or occupancy has already happened. If we're making the offer and we haven't received the RPODs within, which either one happens first, 3rd calendar day following receipt or 3rd calendar day following the effective date, the buyer shall have the right to terminate This is one of the rare times that they will get their due diligence back. And also their earnest money if they put it up. So listing agents, if you have sellers digging their heels in and completing this form, make sure they understand you could be giving the buyer an out, a free out, if they don't have it. And remember, guys, the buyer is not acknowledging how it's completed. They're just acknowledging that it is complete. Caveat emptor says the seller has the right to say no representation. They're just acknowledging signing receipt. This could be an out, get their due diligence back. The third one here is if the RPODS is exempt. When we look at those guidelines to complete, it gives us a laundry list of things of why the RPODS might be exempt. A lot of those reasons are like transfer from a court order, for example. But I'll tell you, the number one reason when the RPODS would be exempt is new construction or never before lived in dwelling. It's hard to attest to the components of the home if nobody's ever lived there. Then we go through the same little exercise again with the MOG. Buyer has received it prior to making this offer. Buyer has not received it, in which case they shall have the right to terminate within whichever happens first, the end of the third calendar day following receipt, or the end of the third calendar day following the effective date. Again, there's reasons for exemptions for the MOG as well. See the guidelines for the list. The MOG is required for new construction. So if you're doing new construction, you have the MOG, you won't have the RPODS. One time that the MOG is exempt is on vacant land. The MOG's only required when there's a structure on the land. But when in doubt, you can see those guidelines to see the complete list. Questions on that? Our MOG is usually attached to, yep, it's usually there as well in MLS. So as soon as your buyer calls you and says, hey, can we go see 123 Main Street tomorrow? The first thing you want to do is log into MLS and see what's in those attachments. Sometimes seller disclose problems. Sometimes the buyer knows up front if they want to deal with it or not. Sometimes they don't, but sometimes they do. So it's worth checking out. What did I see one in the RPODS? My buyers and I, obviously it wasn't this market, it's many years ago. My buyers and I were spending like a Saturday together. I think we were out looking at like 10 or 11 properties. I mean, I had a lunch break scheduled in between, potty breaks. We were together all day. And so we're going to meet at the office. Everybody's going to hop in my car and ride with me. On their way to meet me, my buyers called and said, can we add another property in our showings today? Of course, to which I said, sure, absolutely. So I'm scrambling, trying to figure out when the heck we're going to get this in. Went to MLS, pulled up the RPODS. Warning, danger, black toxic mold, must wear masks, proceed with caution. Said, oh my God. Buyer showed up, I showed it to them. They said, we don't want to see that. I said, good. I appreciated the seller sharing that with us. Obviously, they were concerned about our health. I appreciate him sharing them. All you need is the buyer that's not afraid of mold, that knows how to handle it or who to call. That house eventually sold, but we appreciated the heads up. This is before the day we all had masks on us at all times anyway, so we weren't prepared. Another form we're going to look at next week, it's not addressed here, but you might have an owners association addendum disclosure, or disclosure addendum, owner association disclosure addendum. That's in the event of new construction and the RPODS isn't required. So that's just information on the HOA. So if new construction, we don't have an RPODS, but we still need to disclose information about the HOA. We can use that owners association disclosure addendum. So we'll see that next week. And buyer's receipt of the MOG does not modify or limit the obligations of the seller under paragraph 8G below of this contract, and shall not constitute the assumption or approval by buyer of any severance of any minerals or oils or gases, except those that may be assumed or specifically approved by the buyer in writing. Our note tells us the parties are advised to consult with an attorney prior to signing this contract if the severance of mineral and oil or gas rights has occurred. If the owner or the previous owner has severed the rights, those are some big legality issues that our cute little one-page form doesn't address. So if we are dealing with severance of subsurface rights, we're instructed to talk to an attorney to make sure it's handled properly. So 5 is the buyer representations. Again, the buyer needs to complete this section truthfully, because the seller should be able to rely on this information when they're deciding to contract with the buyer. The last provision specifically for the buyer, number 6, is the buyer obligations. So 4, 5, and 6 are all about the buyers. We defined special assessment back on page 3. Now that we're talking about the buyer obligations, the buyer shall take subject to all special assessments that may be approved following settlement. So the buyer's not responsible for paying special assessments unless they're approved after settlement. If the seller knows of any proposed special assessments, they should disclose that to the buyer. And we have a place when we get into the seller sections for them to do that. Give them a heads up. There's a proposal on the table. If they vote aye after closing, the buyer will be responsible for paying those. Buyer has obligations, responsibility for certain costs. Buyer shall be responsible for all costs with respects to anything to do with their loan, charges by an owners association. Let's see, the appraisal, title search, title insurance, any fees charged by the closing attorney for the preparation of the closing disclosure, recording of the deed, and preparation and recording of all instruments required to secure the balance of the purchase price unpaid at settlement. So it gives us a nice list of things that the buyer is responsible for, the debits to the buyer. And then authorization to disclose information. The buyer authorizes their lender, their agent, their closing attorney to provide a copy of this contract to anybody that needs it as a settlement service provider throughout the contract to closing process. So remember, buyers agents, when we went under contract, as soon as we got that signed contract in our hand, we sent it to the lender. As soon as we send it to the lender, the next thing we do, we send it to the closing attorney so they can start their thing. Is there anybody else in between that needs a copy of the contract? We have permission to do that. So we don't have to worry about sharing somebody else's contract. They've given us that authorization to disclose, so we can keep those gears turning. We can keep the contract to closing process moving. Any questions on provisions 4, 5, and 6? All about the buyer. I love that they break that out. If you're a buyer's agent, you know specifically what to focus on. I used to work with a lady and I loved it. She took an offer to purchase and contract and color coded it. So she had like one color for the seller, one color for the buyer. She had a green highlighter anytime she talked about money. So she color coded the offer to purchase and contract. And then the first time and then made copies of it. So every time she met with a buyer or seller, she could say, buyer, you're blue. So every time you see blue, that's something about you. Every time you see green, that's something about money. I thought that was really clever. And what a great way to help buyers and sellers better understand this daggum 16-page document. I really, truly always appreciated her What a great idea. What a great way to help protect your clients. So if 4, 5, and 6 are all about the buyer, provisions 7 and 8 are all about the seller. So listing agents, these are your sellers' provisions, making sure they're aware, they know what's going on. The first thing we have is seller representations. Again, the seller needs to complete this section accurately. The buyer should be able to rely on the accuracy of this information when they're deciding if they want to contract with the seller. So the first thing that the seller is going to represent is their ownership. How long have they owned the property? They've owned it for at least a year, they've owned it for less than 1 year, or they do not yet own the property. Who is the seller? Typically, who is the seller that owns it for less than 1 year? Typically.
Investors.
Your
Investors,
investors.
flipper.
The flipper, that's right, that's right. Now anybody can buy a house, turn around, sell it within a year, right? And that's why we say typically. Some loan types matter how long the seller's on the property. For example, FHA requires the seller to have owned the property for 90 days. Now, it's still less than a year, but there may be flags. My point is there may be flags that go up from the lender if it's owned for less than a year, just to make sure that it's in compliance with that property. So that's why we want the seller to identify that. The other thing, does not yet own the property. I feel like attorneys are going to be involved if you're trying to contract to sell something that you don't own yet. But one of the examples we saw where we used that box, the buyer was building and the builder was going to buy the land, build on it, and then sell the whole thing as a package deal to the buyer when it was done. And when we were contracting with the buyer to build, the builder hadn't owned the property yet. They were working on it. It was still in process, but they didn't own it yet. So that may be a time that we use that box. Obviously, that's the rarer used one. But again, if we're running into legal or legality issues about whether or not they own it yet, we just need to touch base with our attorney. The buyer has to represent if the property is built prior to 1978. Once you get through these tests, you can forget that year. It's on all of our documentation, something you don't have to waste brain space with. If it was built prior to 1978, we're told to attach the lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazard disclosure addendum. Owners Association and dues, seller authorizes and directs any owners association, management company of the owners association, insurance company, and any attorney who has previously represented the seller to release to the buyer, their agent representatives, copies of the following items affecting the property, including any amendments. So here's just a laundry list of documents that may or may not be available from the homeowners association, from the HOA. This exact list also shows up in our listing agreement. So we can have a conversation with the seller, help them start gathering these documents now, because we know a good buyer's agent is going to ask for this. So the sooner we get it, the sooner we have available to make available to any potential buyers. If it is in an HOA, the seller needs to represent the name of the association, how much the regular dues are. It's going to be X amount per month, per quarter, per year, however that's spelled out. The contact information of the HOA and the website, if applicable. You can see I have a place for 2 HOAs. Some places, for example, you might have the mandatory HOA and then an optional HOA for the pool. For example, there may be 2, one's required, one's optional. The seller is just providing the information for the buyer. So there's two HOAs, split it all out. And then we come to fuel tanks. This section was just added to our contract, this revision, July 2022. And again, this is one of these things, they're organizing the contract a little bit better and I like it. Fuel tanks were talked about, y'all, I'm not kidding, in like 4 or 5 different places of the contract. And you had to remember, you talk about a fuel tank here, 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 and here. What they did last year, they locked fuel tanks all together. So everything we're going to say about a fuel tank is in one nice place, much better organization, right? A lot easier for me and you to see it all right here. So to the best of the seller's knowledge, there is or is not a fuel tank located on the property. If yes, now we're told to complete the following. So I have a place, tank 1 and tank 2. Is it currently in use or not in use? Is it owned or leased? Is it above ground, below ground? What kind of fuel is in the tank? And then the name and contact information of the fuel vendor. We'll go through that little exercise again. If there's 2 tanks on the property, tanks are included in the sale. Buyer and seller agree that any tank described above that is owned by seller shall be included in the sale as part of the purchase price, free of liens, unless excluded in paragraph 2E above. That was our fixture exclusions. So if we need to exclude anything about the fuel tank, we'll list that above. Fuel, this is what puts people in court after closing. So they addressed it in our contract. Seller may use fuel in the tank described above through settlement, but may not otherwise remove the fuel or resell it. Any fuel remaining in the tank as of settlement shall be included in the sale of the purchase price, free of liens. Seller's use of fuel in any fuel tank is subject to their obligation below to provide working existing utilities through the earlier of closing or possession. There were cases, you guys, so many stories. The sellers out there with their, the gas tank for their lawnmower, trying to drain the fuel because I paid for this. It's my fuel. Dang it, I'm going to take it with me. So many people have wound up in court over fuel. So you know what the contract did? They said, stop it. Whatever's there, seller uses what they need to while they own the property. Whatever's there through settlement becomes property of the buyers. So what does this mean? You're going to list a property and you're going to go over this with the seller, and the seller's going to say, I just paid $500 to have that thing filled up. You telling me that's a waste of money? You telling me I'm not going to get it back? Wham, wham, wham. All right. Tack on $500 to the asking price. And that way we know we can get your seller their purchase price plus the $500 they just spent on that fuel. Petty, petty, petty. Contract addresses that now. You can't make this stuff up. That's the fun thing about real estate. I don't have to create stories. This stuff happens. 2 blue notes. Buyers shall be entitled to conduct inspections to confirm the existence, type, and ownership of any fuel tank located on the property. Buyers advised to consult with the owner of any leased fuel tank regarding the terms under which the buyer may lease the tank and obtain fuel. So part of the reason the seller providing the name and contact information of the vendor, the seller knows who to call, to transfer that account over to them. The other one addresses state law, provides it's unlawful for any person other than the supplier or the owner of a fuel supply tank to disconnect, interrupt, or fill the supply tank with liquefied petroleum gas without the consent of the supplier. So hopefully that blue note is what helps people from tampering with the tank or trying to drain it, disconnect it prior to settlement. Huge improvement to the contract, this whole section on fuel. And I think it addresses anything that we need about fuel. If it doesn't, let's get our attorney involved to fine tune it. But definitely big improvements, not just the organization, but a lot of this verbiage that clears up some of the concerns and confusions from the past. Questions? All right, I'm gonna cut it here. Don't go anywhere just yet. Let's talk about what next weekend's gonna look like. Saturday, we're gonna finish the offer to purchase and contract. We're gonna look at, it's our forms day next Saturday. So we're gonna look at the commonly used addenda, those that we've mentioned so far in the contract. A couple other ones that we need to look at. So lots of forms. When we get done with that, if we don't wrap up chapter 11, we'll be very close. The last little section of this class, most of the time when you take post licensing or CE, we're going to throw in a little bit, something about your license, active versus inactive, current versus expired, you guys as provisional brokers, some things you may need to know, just a couple licensing law things. So we'll probably wrap all that up on Sunday. Sunday, we'll also do CD number 4. Remember, I encourage you guys to look at that this week, get prepared for that test on Sunday. As time allows, we'll try to get a quick review in Sunday late morning, early afternoon. I know we've covered a lot. So hopefully with a quick review on Sunday, we can fine tune it to some more important points that we're going to see Sunday afternoon. Sunday afternoon, we take the test. You guys get 3 hours, which means I have until 2 o'clock to start this test, because I need to make sure I give you your full 3 hours. So we'll take a lunch and all that on Sunday as well. Hopefully, like I said, we'll have time for a quick review so we can get you in the right track, the right frame of mind for that test. So that's what next weekend's going to look like. We're halfway there, 50% there. How's that? See, I like math. Okay. If I have any questions, if there's anything I can help with, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I will load today's class in our YouTube channel later this evening. I got to let things process and upload and do its thing. But probably by the time you're sitting down for breakfast tomorrow morning, you'll have both videos available to you. Everybody good? All right. Y'all have a great rest of your day. Again, happy Father's Day, and/or go see your father whenever you can. Tell him happy Father's Day. We'll see you guys Saturday. We'll start at 9 a.m. sharp.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
And don't forget to sell a house this week too.